The CoCo Crew Podcast is hosted by CyberEars. If you are serious about your podcast hosting needs, you should check out CyberEars. Whether you are a podcaster, a radio host, a musician, a narrator, an audiobook author, or simply a school, church, corporation, or anyone else with an audio recording that needs to be hosted or distributed, you should check out cyberears.com. Unlimited bandwidth, fast, reliable, and rugged servers with no hidden fees. CyberEars, your audio, your terms.
Listen, it's getting closer.
Hey, you got your CoCo 3 yet? Hey, you got your CoCo 3 yet?
You're listening to the CoCo Crew Podcast, a delicious adventure into the world of retro computing news and information featuring the Tandy Color Computer. Okay, welcome back to the episode 6 of the CoCo Crew. This is John Linville.
And Neil Blanchard.
And we are the CoCo Crew. So it is just after Thanksgiving in the U.S.
Gobble, gobble.
And CoCo Fest is now about 5 months away. Neil, you got your projects underway or decided on for CoCo Fest? You know what you're going to be bringing?
I have a project in mind.
You do? Is
I
it
do.
secret?
Yeah, I'm going to probably reveal it probably a couple months from now.
Okay.
I'm
Cool.
working on
All right. I've got a couple of irons in the fire. I'm not really sure if they're CoCo Fest specific yet or not, but we'll see. I might mention stuff at least inadvertently as we continue talking. Let's see. Well,
5 months, it's down to crunch time.
yeah, it kind of is getting there. CoCo Fest is, the big event for those of us who love the cocoa. I hope with the episodes we've had so far, including this one, that we're encouraging a few people to come out that might not otherwise have come out or might not even have known about CoCo Fest. I hope to see some new faces there. I hope to see all the old faces there. It's the venue's big enough, but I'd like to see us blow the doors off, standing room only. Wouldn't that be cool?
That'd be great. Taking it back, Rainbow Fest.
Rainbow Fest levels of attendance. That would be awesome. It would be cool if we had to get a bigger venue. The Glenside guys are saying, "Oh wait, no, don't sign us up for that." But no, that would be cool. So CoCo Fest is on the horizon. For those who don't know, generally at CoCo Fest we have a kind of a show floor atmosphere, and people bring their projects they've been working on. And some people bring their projects, some people bring stuff for sale. Sometimes it's the same thing. This is my project, and here you can buy one. I think a lot of people try to have something to show at CoCo Fest, or at least something to talk about, right?
Or even if you want to come out to CoCo Fest and just walk around and chat with us and see the different displays, that's great too.
Well, sure, absolutely. If you just want to come and put your toe in the community, or you don't have to have a project to show up. It'd be nice if you at least tell everyone else how cool their projects are. But you can just walk around. You don't have to have a project of your own.
That's always good.
Come out, maybe play a game or two, buy some stuff in the no minimum bid auction. It'll be great fun for the entire family, or at least all the nerdy ones. Anyway, so Neil, what have you been up to in the past month? Doing anything cool?
I've been trying out other people's projects, actually.
Yeah.
And I've been beta testing a game for John Strong.
Oh, yeah?
So that's
cool.
coming along pretty good. It's this Minesweeper game called the Bomb Squad.
Awesome.
Yeah, and that uses the high-res mouse driver Nick and John wrote.
Yeah, and there's what kind of media is he targeting for that game?
Yeah, he's going to go on a ROM cartridge.
Oh, yeah? Well, that's cool. I like the ROM cartridges these days, huh?
They last the test of time, too.
They do. They are. It's you don't have to worry about your floppy drive dying. That's for sure. Let's see. Well, so myself, I've been poking around a bit. I've got a couple of things going on that I've been poking around a little bit at sort of a mini game or maybe a collection of mini games that are sort of Christmas themed. I'm not sure if I'm actually going to be able to get them into a showable shape by this Christmas, but maybe by next Christmas we'll have a Christmas themed CoCo game. That might be cool.
Nothing wrong with that. That's great. I like mini games too.
Yeah. I noticed that there was a Christmas themed cartridge for the Vectrix that sold recently on eBay for a ridiculous amount of money. So there must be some amount of demand for these things. I know also on the Intellivision platform, there's a game that's been out for a few years called Christmas Carol that seems to be popular there. So I think people like sort of the novelty of that sort of thing. So I don't know if maybe someone else will beat me to it, but if not, then maybe I can get some sort of Christmas theme gamed out in the next year or two. That'd be cool. The other thing I've been working on a bit, some of people may have seen on Facebook that I was working on an interface for what started out. It's the base circuit is an interface for adapting Atari style joysticks to the CoCo joysticks. You know, the Atari joysticks, of course, are digital, and the CoCo joysticks are analog. So the base circuit's been around. Oh, there's a couple of variations out there, but the base circuit, there's one out on Cocopedia, and there's some problems with that schematic, I think, but mostly it works. And traditionally, like the old Wyco adapters, they work great, except you only get the one button, like on the original CoCo 1 and 2. So on a CoCo 3, you're missing out on the second button. You can wire up the second button, and so then instead of just Atari adapters or the Atari controllers, you can use the Sega Master System controllers, which have a second button. So that's cool. The Sega Genesis controllers also have a second button, and so those should work, although depending on the way you've implemented the circuit, you may or may not have some problems.
The nice thing with that, there's no shortage of the Genesis controllers either.
Yeah, so that's a good thing to have. And then, so what I was experimenting with is on the Sega Genesis controllers, actually, there's a select line which basically multiplexes between the two buttons that by default are mapped as the button B and button C, mapped to the button 1 and 2 on the CoCo. But there's a select line that you can switch, and so then you get button A and the start button available as well. So you get 4 buttons for the price of 2, essentially. And so I've been working a bit with a circuit to implement that. So unfortunately, it took a little time away from my Christmas mini game. But anyway, so I've been keeping a little busy too.
It sounds like you have too many projects and too little time.
I definitely have too many projects, too little time, and probably too much stuff, which of course brings me to maybe the next topic. So how about eBay, Neil? You've been active on eBay this month?
I have, but not for buying.
No?
For selling, actually. I got a tweaked and peaked fully loaded Color Computer 3 listed right now.
Oh, yeah?
Posted it for a Black Friday special.
Cool. Very exciting. Does that look like it's doing well?
But as for buying, it's been pretty dry. I have nothing.
No?
No.
No. Well, I had kind of a big month, I guess. The most interesting thing was actually a French CoCo 2. So the French CoCo 2 is actually the only CoCo 2s that actually put out an RGB video signal. And so they instead of the normal RF out or as you'd have on a NTSC machine or even the PAL machines have RF out, although they convert of course to PAL instead of NTSC video. But on these machines, the circuit's replaced with one that generates RGB. It's basically 50 hertz RGB, so it's similar to what the PAL machines would put out. But instead of going to an RF modulator, it breaks it out to a little mini DIN connector on the back, and then it comes with a cable that goes from the mini DIN to the what is sometimes called the Paratel or SCART TV connector, which was a popular connector on machines and on television machines or televisions in Europe. And it happens that I have a monitor here that accepts the SCART input. And so I got this French CoCo in with the SCART cable and hooked it up to that monitor, and I was able to see RGB out from a CoCo too. So pretty cool stuff.
That RGB must look pretty crisp.
It does. It looks very nice. Of course, it's still a 6847, so the colors are atrocious. But, you learn to love them as a CoCo person. But, yeah, it's cool. You can watch, you can see stuff on a regular video monitor. And so it's CoCoing with a French accent. So I think I'm going to nickname this machine Boise. Oh, Boise, I kid. I love you, man. In an earlier episode, the one on the 6809, I mentioned that there was a device associated with a TI-99 called a MBX expansion system, which had voice synthesis and actually could do some voice recognition, and it had an extra joystick and extra kind of keyboard input for the TI-99, which is interesting because inside the box is a 6809 processor. Anyway, so I had not heard of it before I did that episode on the 6809. Kind of took an interest, and this month I actually found one at a reasonable price, and I was able to acquire that. Got it home, and I haven't really had a chance to play with it yet, but now I've got it. So I'd say it's in the 6809. It's in the family, so we'll talk about it here some. Oh, and one more thing, I did pick up an old data book, a Motorola data book from 1986. And the reason I picked this up is because when we mentioned in the episode on the SAM, the 6883, I mentioned that the part number, the 6883 is the Motorola part number, and then it also sometimes went by the 74LS783. And you can find the data sheet for that pretty easily. But then there was a later version of the SAM, which it can support a slightly different kind of memory chips. And that's the SAM that's found in the later CoCo 2s that have the 6847T1. The special version of the VDG. Anyway, so that part goes by 74LS785, and I had a lot of trouble finding a data sheet that covered the 785, but I found a reference that said it was in this specific Motorola data book, and I was able to go on eBay and find that exact data book, and picked it up, and it arrived as correct. It does have references to the 785. It's not a separate data sheet. It's actually in the same data sheet as the 783. It's minor details of difference, but if I ever need to know what's different in the data sheet between the 783 and the 785, now I've got the source information. So very cool stuff, right?
Hey, that's a good resource to have for sure.
Yeah, pretty cool stuff. I mean, you have to be the right kind of nerd to want that hanging around the house, but I think I probably am. Anyway, so rather than being an antisocial nerd collecting old data books off the internet, you actually had a little social event this past month.
I did. Yeah, it was pretty interesting, actually. Mike Rowan came up from Indiana. Well, actually, he found a PC museum about an hour away from my house in Brantford, Ontario, and it is an hour away from my place. Now, that's the embarrassing part. I knew about this museum for years, and I just never went. And about 4 months ago, he emailed me saying he found this place, and I'd like to check it out. So a couple weeks ago, he came up and went and checked out this museum. And what makes this museum really cool is that most of the computers are actually plugged in and functioning, so you can actually use them.
Wow, that's really cool. I saw the pictures. It looked like an exciting place to go. How big was the place?
It looks bigger in the pictures than it is, but they have so much crammed in that it still takes a good couple hours to get through it all, because there's also 2 levels. There's an upstairs as well.
Oh, that's cool. And so you actually could put your hands on the keyboards and type stuff on these machines?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we used lots of the machines, and that's where I got to try a Vectrex for the first time.
Yeah.
Pretty impressed with it.
Yeah, the Vectrex is cool, and also a 6809 base machine, so fair game on this podcast as far as I'm concerned.
Definitely. And just for the records, they did have CoCos hooked up. They had a Color Computer 3 with a CM8 monitor, so they're in our good books.
Awesome. Very good.
Mike was saying on the way in, he said, too bad we can't buy anything. And I said, well, that's probably a good thing.
Yeah, exactly. It's easy to get carried away if you have the fever. You start buying stuff, and pretty soon your place looks like a storehouse for a crazed reject from the 80s. At least that's how my place looks. Anyway, well, so I'd say that's a pretty good introduction, a good start for our show. So maybe we'll pause for a word from our sponsors, and we'll be back with the announcements.
Now, if there is any dedicated group of old computer users, it is certainly the people who still love their CoCo, the Tandy Color computer.
Okay, welcome back. Now we'll have a brief run of announcements. So this is the CoCo Crew Podcast, and we are available on Twitter as at CoCo Crew Podcast. We have a Facebook page. Just search for the CoCo Crew Podcast. The podcast is available through iTunes. It's available for streaming on Stitcher. And once they open up their podcast section on Google Play, we should already be listed there. This month, we announced that we are a new member of the Throwback Network. The Throwback Network is a collection of retro-themed podcasts, many of which are about technology and computing, but not all of them. There are a few oddballs in there. I think there's some that are just about generic 80s nostalgia. There's a Rediscover the 80s podcast. There's the Toys R Us Report. I think there's even one about the Greatest American Hero, the old TV show from the 80s. Of course, there's also the Intellivisionaries and Floppy Days, ColecoVisions podcast, Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast, Boo Atari. Sorry, I stole that one from Quinn Dunkey. Anyway. Threw that in there for the benefit of the Antic folks. They should appreciate it. Anyway, the Throwback Network is a great source for other retro-themed podcasts if you're looking for something to listen to when there's no new CoCo Crew podcast episodes available. The CoCo Crew Podcast, or audio for the CoCo Crew Podcast, is hosted at Cyber Ears. If you have needs to host a audio file for access over the internet, you should consider the facilities available at Cyber Ears.
We should also mention our listeners. We've had quite a few downloads.
That's right. Let's see. Where are we at right now? I think I checked earlier, and we were above 320 downloads for the previous episode. And let's see, where are we at now? Yeah, so 322 for episode 5. I think we're at 427 for episode 4, and 524 for episode 3. Not too shabby.
Was that the episode we were giving away the free CoCo?
I'm not so sure about that, but anyway, on Stitcher, let's see, our last month's total active listeners was 6.
It's getting up there.
So far this month, we're at 5. I don't know if that's backsliding or if that's going to end up even. I'm glad Stitcher has us as part of their offering, but I'm not sure how much traffic it generates for us. If you want to reach us for feedback, please do. By the way, we'd love to hear from you. Obviously, you can reach us through Facebook, or you can send us email. If you want to reach both Neil and I for feedback, you can send it to the show at cococrew.org, podcast at cococrew.org, or feedback at cococrew.org. And if you wanted to reach us individually, I'm available as John at cococrew.org, and Neil is, of course, available as Neil, that's Neil, at cococrew.org. On the subject of feedback, several of you do send us email from time to time. I also would like to plant the seed that would be happy for you to send us an audio feedback with your own recorded audio, your own message. And as long as it's reasonably appropriate, I think we'd probably be happy to put something on the air. So you can send us a message, tell us how great we are and what's going on, what you think is exciting in the CoCo community. I think that'd be a nice addition to the podcast. What about you, Neil?
That'd be great to get that in the mix. Jason Timmons, if you're listening to this, VCF Midwest, please send your audio clip.
Well, there you go, calling them out. So those are all our standard announcements. This time I wanted to add a few just announcements for the month. There's a new podcast that I think some of you might be interested in. It's called Vectrix Radio. And so it is, of course, a podcast with the theme of or themed around the Vectrix gaming system. The Vectrix, as I mentioned earlier, is, of course, based on the 6809 processor, which is the same as the processor in the CoCo. And so it's unique in its own way because it uses the vector monitor. But if you're someone who programs for the CoCo or someone who programs for the Vectrix, I'm sure you could swap to the other platform and find yourself at home in many ways. So maybe we should try to cross-pollinate those communities. That'd be a cool thing, don't you think?
With the 6809, that's good enough for me.
So that'd be really cool. There's another new source of video entertainment, I guess, on YouTube. It's a source of game reviews and some other content. This is the original gamer, Stevie Stroh. This Stevie is kind of, I don't know how long he's been doing his game reviews. He kind of popped up on the radar this month because he's added a CoCo game review playlist, and it is up to, well, some of them still aren't quite available yet. They're kind of pre-posted, I guess, but we're talking on the order of 75 videos with game reviews for Dino Wars and Demolition Derby, Demon Attack, Color Baseball, Cave Hunter.
That's 75 reviews of just CoCo games?
It's CoCo games. Yeah, they're all CoCo games. And I mean, he has other games as well, but anyways, the link in the show notes to the page he has set up where he not only has the link to his YouTube series for the CoCo game reviews, he also has a number of other links he's collected that, especially if you're new to the CoCo community, you might find some of them useful. Many of them are the same kind of links that we normally carry, but there's a few others that you might not otherwise have heard about. So go ahead and check out the original gamer, Stevie Stroh. Stevie, I know you've mentioned in some of your comments that, A, that you're listening to our podcast, and B, that you're thinking about coming to CoCo Fest. So I'm calling you out. If you got time to post 75 CoCo game reviews, you are a nut and need to find a way to get to Lombard, Illinois, in April of 2016.
I definitely think so. I mean, if he's done that many CoCo game reviews, he should be there.
So on a more somber note, not strictly a CoCo announcement, but for those of us who grew up doing some BBSing in the late 80s and early 90s, many of us would have used Z modem for file transfers. And so in the past month, we have learned the death of Chuck Forsberg, who was the creator of Z modem. Don't really have a lot to say there other than put a link in the show notes that will take you to Chuck's memorial information. Like I said, it's one of the founders of our technological present, and might be of interest to some of the listeners that Chuck has passed.
Z modem was the best.
Z modem was really awesome. It was
incredible.
Clearly, I can't remember any situation where it wasn't the best performing protocol for that type of transfer, for serial point-to-point transfer. There may have been some, but there weren't many. It was cool, and plus it had the signature identification, so that rather than having to start the transfer at the remote end and then start it on your local end, you could just start it at the opposite end, and it would recognize that initial signature and start their download automatically. I'm not sure why the other protocols couldn't do that, but
I remember installing Z modem on my BBS when I ran one, and what a difference it made from the other ones.
It was very efficient compared to the
Like,
X and Y modem, and so very, very cool. Anyways, so Chuck, we're sorry to see you go, but thanks for the memories, buddy. Okay, another announcement, more CoCo centric. Many of you will remember Roger Taylor. Roger no longer participates in the CoCo mailing list. He does show up on Facebook some and possibly in some of the other forums. Roger has been working on an FPGA-based CoCo implementation. I think he's targeting a CoCo 2 at this point, with possibly an eye towards going beyond that in the future. Anyway, he's basing it on a DE0 FPGA development board, and he's got some sort of daughter card to plug it into to implement the CoCo stuff. He's been posting some videos of his machine playing different games. He even posted one showing it playing this obscure CoCo game called Farfall. Anyway, Roger has started a GoFundMe project, or I guess is what you call them, a GoFundMe. Anyway, he's got a GoFundMe to help with his prototyping and development of his FPGA-based CoCo alternative. So if that's the sort of thing that interests you, we have a link in the show notes. You may want to go and check it out. GoFundMe. That's called CoCo on a Chip.
I think when you saw Farfall running on it, it got your attention.
Yeah. Unfortunately, he seemed to be playing a Farfall Alpha 3 or something. It's like, well, the betas are 2 years old now. Or something. So I think he probably needs to check the Farfall website there and download a later version. But alas, whatever. So one more announcement. This one also CoCo specific, and this ties back into CoCo Fest. So at CoCo Fest, we tend to, along with our show floor, we tend to have a few seminars where people stand up and they talk about various things. Some of them are vendors like Cloud9 will usually have a presentation on whatever project or whatever new products they have that year. I tend to do some presentations on what projects I've worked on. I asked for a couple of seminars this round, a couple of slots, one to do something about this podcast, and then one maybe for my own personal projects. Anyway, the point is Brian Goers, who is the coordinator for those seminar slots, has sent out a call a little early this year. He's calling for people who are interested in doing the seminar at CoCo Fest. And I guess the CoCo or the organizers of CoCo Fest this year, they want to put together. It's the 25th anniversary, and so they would kind of want to do up a little nicer than usual. They're going to do a show guide, so a printed guide that'll cover vendors and the events and what seminars and stuff are available. Deadline March 15th. So if you're interested in, being covered in the guide, I think it might even cover attendees. Certainly, if you're interested in hosting having a seminar session, then you need to reach out to Brian as soon as possible and let him know.
25th anniversary, that's another reason to get people out. If you've never been to CoCo Fest before, you can say you've been to the 25th anniversary fest.
Yeah, the Silver CoCo Fest. How about that, huh?
That was great.
Who would have thought that we'd still be doing CoCo Fest all these years later? How many years have you come to CoCo Fest, Neil?
Since 2010.
I think I started coming in 2001. I think I might have skipped 1 year in between. So, so it'd be 15 for me then this year?
Wow, that's great.
Wow, that's a long time. Anyway, it's a great event. Anybody who has an interest in CoCo should come out. It's great to meet other crazy people that are the same kind of crazy as you are. It's a great opportunity to buy new stuff to trick out your CoCo. It can be a great opportunity to find rare to find historical peripherals or even CoCo specific models or that sort of stuff. It's a great place to find, old magazines or books. You get to meet all the people. It's a great thing. And like I said, I don't know anybody who shows up for CoCo Fest that doesn't like it. I don't think I've ever talked to anybody who was in that situation, and I try to talk to all the newcomers every year. Probably don't manage to do so, but I try to talk to them. And definitely most people, if anything, their reaction is, why didn't I come sooner?
It's true. You hear that from a lot of people, and I even brought a couple of friends of mine a few years ago, and they don't even have a CoCo, and they still had a good time.
Yeah, so it's a good event. If we haven't made it clear, we'd love to see all of you guys, everyone listening. We'd love to see you show up at CoCo Fest. Anyway, well, that probably is enough for our announcement segment this time around. We'll be back in a bit with the news.
Well, good afternoon. And my name's Tony Pedraza, and I am the host of the annual last Chicago CoCo Fest. We call it the last in quotes because we really don't know if we're going to have another one. And we haven't known every year for the past 17 years.
Okay, and now we're back with some news. Okay, our first item is this is going to be a dragon item. So our folks, our dragon cousins, over on World of Dragon, archive.worldofdragon.org, they have the ROM from the Orchestra 90 pack, which of course is a stereo 8-bit DAC cartridge that plugs into the CoCo and has some software in it, to assist with synthesizing music. The Dragon folks have taken that ROM and patched it up so that it runs correctly on the Dragon. I'm not sure if they had to modify the keyboard routines. Maybe they did. Probably more importantly, they had to change the output so that instead of writing to the Orchestra 90's DACs, it just combines the data and writes it out to the single DAC on the Dragon 64, which I think is the same as what's on the CoCo. So that ROM image that they're using on the Dragon might work on the CoCo as well without the Orchestra 90. Anyway, it's pretty long thread, a couple of pages at least on their forums over there. Pretty neat read, some cool hacking. If that sort of thing interests you, then you may want to go and check it out. Next item comes from Mark McDougall. Mark points out to us that the MAME guys, or MES guys, have corrected some problems with their emulation of a card called the Stellation, the Mill 6809 card for the Apple II. And so this card, if it wasn't clear, is a card that plugs into the Apple II but has a 6809 processor on it. And similar to how many people are familiar with the CPM cards that plugged into the Apple II that had a Z80 on them. This is sort of the same idea, but with a 6809. Along with just being the 6809, something that makes that interesting is that at least some versions of the card were actually able to then also boot up OS 9 running on essentially an Apple II machine. I think the way it works is the 6502 would run some code that basically allowed it to handle basic I/O for the keyboard and the touch to be able to run your shell over on the 6809 card, running the OS 9 shell and running OS 9 programs over there. I think it also had packages where it could do some other stuff. I think it had a Apple Pascal software package that would take advantage of the 6809 and maybe some other stuff. I guess they had the problem with emulating this card, sort of programming error, or maybe, I know there are two versions of the card, or it's really one card with a different piece of configuration hardware on it or whatever. I've actually got one, but it's the version that doesn't actually run OS 9. So basically the memory map that the 6809 sees with the version of the card I have is incompatible with the way OS 9 expects to see memory. And so later they came out with basically another, like a PAL or GAL chip that you could swap it out, or maybe it's a little daughter card or something like that would change the addressing on the card and actually made the address map for the 6809 look like the address map that the Z80 uses when it's booting CPM. But anyway, so maybe what they had emulated in MES was doing it the way the card I have was doing it, and now they have it where it can also do the other version of the card that can boot OS 9. One way or another, the emulation now is working in MES. You can boot up an emulated 6809 processor plugged into an emulated Apple II, all running OS 9 under that emulation. And I think it's just stock OS 9. No reason that somebody couldn't make it run Nitrous 9. So that'd be a cool project if you're so inclined. What do you think about that, Neil?
Yeah, say it's just a matter of days now. You'll see Nitrous running on there.
That'd be cool, wouldn't it?
I think it'd be great to see even CoCo application or video game running on that.
Yeah, so like I said, I have one of those cards, and I have contemplated, before I actually started porting Farfall to the 6502 on the Apple II, I had contemplated seeing if I could get Farfall ported to the 6809 on that card plugged into an Apple II. But, it's one of those, like we discussed earlier, I just don't have quite enough time for all the projects. Moving on, we have a couple of news items from Philippe Antoniosi, who is the mastermind behind the RGB to VGA device that allows you to take the RGB signals from the CoCo 3 or from some other similar older machines and display them on a modern VGA monitor. And so the first item that he reported on is that he has been messing around with the code, and now he's got it where instead of outputting at, I guess it was outputting at a 640 by 480 resolution, he now has it where it can output at an 800 by 600 resolution on the VGA. That's irrespective of what resolution you're feeding into it on the RGB side. He can output at 800 by 600 on the VGA side.
And at 800 by 600, it'll look crisper because it's closer to the native resolution.
It probably will look crisper. Certainly, allow for more accurate in any of the conversions for the resolution, I would think. Anyway, so if you have an RGB to VGA, or if you're thinking about getting one, there is some news that ought to interest you. Along the same lines, the same device, Philippe has actually been messing around. Now you can use that device, RGB to VGA, to output or to take the output from the Timex Sinclair 2068 machine and also display that on VGA. And it's a little bit of an inside joke, but the only reason I'm mentioning that, well, partly because it is the RGB to VGA. It's kind of grown up out of the CoCo community, so that's interesting. But also because Bob Swoger, who's one of the Glenside people behind CoCo Fest, he has a history that is sort of outside the CoCo. His actual favorite machine is the Timex Sinclair 2068. So Bob's a great guy, and I get a kick out of him, so I couldn't help but mention this item here. So, Bob, if you haven't already got your RGB to VGA for hooking up your CoCo, now you need to get one for hooking up your Timex.
Yeah, that was the first time I've ever seen that Timex version, too, was a few years back when he brought it to the fest.
Yeah, so that's kind of an interesting machine. That's probably not appropriate for this podcast, but if you're interested at all in the Sinclair line of machines and the Timex Sinclair collaboration, and then how it ultimately kind of got weird and did some funny things at the end, do yourself a favor and go look up the history of the Timex Sinclair 2068.
Yeah, or you can talk to Bob at the fest.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure you can talk to Bob at the fest. That'd be a cool thing. All right, moving on. Next news item concerns the CoCo 3 FPGA. So I mentioned how the CoCo 3 FPGA project actually had a source release not too long ago. And the great thing about releasing the source to something is that sometimes people will pick up the source and do something neat with it that you didn't have the time or interest or capacity to do. And so in this case, and I don't know who this person is, but it's Leslie, or also known as Red Skull DC, over on the CoCo 3 FPGA Yahoo group. He's taken the version 3.0.0.1 CoCo 3 FPGA source and has ported it. So that normally targets the Altera DE1 FPGA development board, and he's now targeted it to the Altera DE2 FPGA development board. So it's a little bit more modern board, and maybe it's something that, even if you may just only have one board, you may already have a DE2 and don't want to buy a DE1. And so in that case, either way, you can get a DE2 and now experiment with the CoCo 3 FPGA. So good job on that, Mr. Red Skull DC. Hopefully he's not going to bring Hydra down and we'll have to have S.H.I.E.L.D. defend us against Leslie, I guess. Sorry, it's throwing out some Marvel jokes. Anyway, moving on. So Mr. Ed Snyder has, over the past, few months or a year or two, he's been doing a lot of cool projects for the CoCo, many of which have involved hardware to output composite NTSC video from the CoCo 2s. And he has boards that support both the Korean and the American versions of the CoCo 2. And so he's, making those machines, extending their useful lifespan a bit and improving video quality along the way. Well, so now he's gone off and sort of done the same trick, but for the MC10. The MC10, of course, is the micro color computer, which is a small machine. Speculations that it was intended to compete with the Timex Sinclair 1000, or also known as the Sinclair ZX81. I'll say that for our Canadian and British listeners. Anyway, that machine is uses the same video chip as the CoCo 2, the 6847. Does not have the SAM, so it's a slightly less flexible on all the video modes that it supports, but it's essentially the same video. It has a different processor. It's a 6803, which is a Motorola processor, not completely unlike the 6809, but not completely the same either. Oh yeah, and of course it runs a version of Color Basic, so it's very similar to the Color Basic available on the CoCo. But so it's a sort of a little cousin to the CoCo. Many of us have one, just maybe out of curiosity, or thought they were cool when they came out years ago. But so if you've got one, you may now want to think about converting it over to composite video. He's doing basically the same thing he's done with the CoCo boards, where he has the jack that he puts on it actually kind of looks like a stereo headphone style of jack on the one end, and then the other end has the RCA cables, similar to what many of the portable DVD players had.
And the nice thing for that, you don't have to modify the case.
That's right. You don't need to change the case to be able to install it and then have all the outputs that you need. So
I think this is going to give me the push to buy an MC10. I'm on the fence about buying one, but I think this is going to bring me over.
Yeah, they're cool little machines. The keyboards are even worse than the than the CoCo ones as far as comfort. But they're kind of cool machines. Certainly, the 6800 is a noteworthy, or 6803 which is a derivative of the 6800, is certainly a noteworthy processor for if you want to exercise your programming skills. Of course, you can program it in BASIC. In fact, I think Jim Gary, who I think we've mentioned, does a lot of games for the CoCos. I think his main target actually is the MC10, and because the basics are so similar, he writes the games in BASIC for the MC10, and then he does a conversion over to the CoCo.
He has a lot of games written for the MC10.
Cool stuff. He even has a tribute game to Farfall in there, I think. So pretty cool.
Check that out.
But so anyway, good job, Ed. Glad you're still plugging along. It's a cool project. I was teasing Ed that now the MC10 needs is an SD card interface. And what else did I try to poke him into? Maybe Bluetooth? I'm not sure. Anyway, next item. This is from Mark J. Blair. This is the same person who a few years back released a PCB design for a CoCo ROM pack replacement PCB for making your own ROM packs. And so now he's sort of completing the set. He's done some 3D modeling for the plastic cases that would go around those PCBs. He's basically cloned the Tandy's packs. So it's a three-part design. So it includes the top and the bottom and the sliding door. And then in his directions, I think he even tells you how to make a spring out of piano wire or whatever. And so he has, I think he did some prints through Shapeways to test them out. And there was someone else that was using a 3D extruded plastic 3D printer that they had at home to do their version of the prints. So they look like it looks like a functional model. If something you're looking for, I think if you go through Shapeways, the price is a bit high. But if you need one, maybe it's a great thing to do.
I'd still say that's ambitious to go with the door.
Yeah, I think it's it's well. I mean, like I said, basically going with what Tandy had. When I cast my own, the ones for the Farfall cartridges I did, replicating the door seemed like a painful step to me. So I actually modified my design a bit so that the molds made parts that don't have a door. They just sort of, the PCB sticks out the bottom like it's sticking its tongue out at you, which I think is kind of an interesting looking design anyway. But and it's probably easier to clean the PCB traces if they do get dirty. But the downside being that they might be more likely to get dirty. Anyway.
Well, with the game Farfall, I mean, it really should never come out of the multi-pack.
Well, you just stick it in there and it never comes out, right? That's the way it works at Neil's house. There's a lot more I'd like to say on this topic, but I'm going to have to wait for a later podcast to make any new announcements there. But the next item is from Matthew Bouchard. Is he in Quebec or is he in France? I was thinking he's in Quebec.
I say Quebec, yeah. I'm pretty sure.
Anyway, so Matthew's posted. His title is which I don't know how to spell with a French accent, but it's CGP 115 Manuel en Français. Basically, he's got a scan of the. You're laughing at my French pronunciation, I guess, but he's got a scan of the CGP 115 manual in French, available as a PDF. Matthew Bouchard. Here's his email signature, says Montreal. So if you have a CGP 115 and you are Quebecois or other French speaker, you want the manual in your native tongue, Matthew has what you need. That link is in the show notes. The next item comes from Stephen H. Fisher. Stephen posted, we're looking for, I guess he has a schematic for a manual to take from the CoCo 3's RGB port to a Sony monitor. It's a Sony KV1311CR. I'd never heard of this monitor. Apparently a lot of other people had. I guess it's a cool monitor. I personally don't know a lot about it. The link's in the show notes to threads on the mailing list. Somebody helped him out and got the design drawn up. If you have that monitor, the Sony KV1311CR, you probably want to check it out. Next item comes from Per Surratt. I think we mentioned Per on an earlier podcast. He's a Dragon fellow. And so his link is debugging a real Dragon with no ice serial port. If you're not familiar with the no ice project, I know it's been around a while, and I think it may target more than just the 6809. Yeah, he targets a number of mostly older processors. But it's essentially a piece of code that runs on a like an embedded system is probably what it's entitled for, but it could be an 80s home computer or whatever. Anyway, it runs on one system, and then you run a program on your local system, and you can step through code and debug programs on it. The fellow that's behind the no ice debugger, I guess he has a soft spot in his heart for the 6809. And so basically, if you're working on a 6809 project and you send him a note, he'll give you a license for his software, I think free of charge, as long as you tell him what your project is. So that's cool. And so Per has done some work to make this work on the Dragon. I'm not sure if it would directly transfer over to the CoCo or not, but it probably wouldn't take a lot of work to port it over if you know what you're doing. So if that's the kind of project that appeals to you, again, you should go and check that out. How about you, Neil? You doing any remote debugging on your Dragon?
No, I still got to get the Dragon hooked up.
Anyway, our next news item comes from Barry Nelson. And so Barry's put together what he calls the ultimate VCC hard disk image. He's using EmuDisk. So EmuDisk is basically a standard for basically fake hardware running on a CoCo emulator that looks like a hard drive controller. And I think it originated with the Jeff Vavasor emulators, but it's supported in VCC and also in MES. I actually have in my CoCo 3 digital video player project, I actually have a version that will support an EmuDisc based video playback from that. Anyway, he's got a disk image that has a lot of CoCo software kind of prepackaged. And so if you are an emulator user and you're looking for a kind of pre-made repository of CoCo software, you may want to check out Barry's Ultimate VCC hard disk image.
And also to note, Barry's working on the same version of that for the CoCo SDC.
So that should be cool. That'll reach out to a slightly different audience, but should be a handy service for them as well. All right, the next item comes from Boise Pete. In our last episode, we sort of poking a little fun at Boise because he had sort of pre-announced a project for basically replacement badges for the CoCo 3. So as you probably know, may or may not totally realize, the CoCo 3s all have badges that say 128K CoCo 3. Even if you bought it with 512K already installed, they also had the 128K badge. And so this has been a point of contention over the years, I guess. So people thought, well, I should have a badge that represents what's really in my CoCo. And at some point, Boise and Mike Rowan got together and commissioned a replacement badge that they did a real good job matching the font and everything, so it looks like it could have rolled right off of Tandy's assembly line. And so you can have your CoCo 3, say it's a 512K CoCo 3.
It really does look amazing, too. Like, it even has the gloss, the same font and everything. You can't tell the difference.
Yep, it looked good. I saw where Joe Grubb was posting on Facebook that he had gotten his installed. So they are shipping, and you can order them from Boise or Mike. I guess you go through Boise, and he'll distribute some orders to Mike as appropriate. So you order from Boise, you might get the shipment from Mike or Boise. Either way, your stuff will show up. So anyway, if that's if having a badge that says 512K on your CoCo 3 appeals to you, well, then contact Boise. Links in the show notes. The next item comes from Al Hartman, and Al lets us know that over on the Vintage Computer Forum, there's a fellow, he's calling himself Sys64738, which I think has the look of some sort of Commodore basic call or something. He says he was a Commodore enthusiast, tipping his toe into the CoCo world. I guess he was trying to play Sockmaster's DK Remix, and but he didn't have a joystick. And so this guy put together a circuit based on the schematic out at Cocopedia, which is one I think I mentioned earlier in the intro. We made a little circuit board. It's kind of cool. It fits inside of the housing of the D-sub connector that plugs into the Atari side of the joystick, and then it has the circuit's all embedded right in there, and then he has a short cable to the CoCo style joystick connector, and it's a cool little project. And so if you want to be able to use Atari joysticks on your CoCo, I don't know if you still got them available for sale or not. I did pick one up off of eBay. It's well made. It's a cool project. Like I said, I'm not sure if they're still for sale, but there's a link in the show notes to the thread, and you can learn more about it. You know, if you're interested in buying one, send the guy a note, see what he has. All right, next item is a note from Tim Lindner, who's a member of the CoCo community in good standing for a long time. Tim he pops up from time to time in a number of retro computing forums and associated with MES and some other stuff. Anyway, Tim has, I guess it's sort of like a blog, or it's not exactly a blog just because it's more of a collection of articles kind of running a website of Tim's own design. Anyway, let's call it a blog. And Tim just posted a post recently on modifying Super Extended Color Basic. And so I guess Tim had reason to have slightly different set of commands in Color Basic for, I guess he wanted to access 16-bit peeks and pokes and slightly differently than what was otherwise available. So he just tells you what kind of patches he made and how he was able to use the extended basic. Anyway, if you're interested in programming in general or the internals of how basic works on the CoCo, you may want to take a look at Tim's article.
Also to note, the other stuff on his website is pretty interesting too. He does have a nice write-up on the copy protection on some DICOM games for the color computer as well. I found that was kind of neat.
Yeah, Tim has a lot of cool articles over there. He also has a great write-up on how the DICOM light gun adapter works. And
that's amazing.
So some other pretty neat stuff. So Tim's an interesting guy. And like I said, he's been around a long time as part of the community. He's got some cool stuff, and it's great that he's writing some of it up and sharing with the rest of us. All right. Anyway, the next item comes from Bill LaJudas. Bill is one of the writing teams, him and Boise, behind the CoCo, the Colorful History of Tandy's Underdog Computer. So Bill does a lot of writing for retro games and technology sort of things. And so he's got an article that he's posted, a look back at the weird, terrible keyboards of 70s and 80s PCs. And so guess which one is the first item pictured? So Bill has put up a CoCo 1 with a chiclet keyboard. I'm not sure if it's fair to say that's the very worst. I think there's probably some even worse keyboards out there. Anyway, I think there's very few people who really want to defend the original chiclet keyboard on the CoCo. I'll say, at least for this, at least it's hard. The keys are hard plastic and not rubber like on the ZX Spectrum. So at least we've got that for us. And they're not flat little bubble, whatever you call them, membranes, like what was on the Atari 400. So there. Take that. Anyway, Bill, we love you. We'll forgive you this one. And we know you've got to cover a number of angles in the retro computing world. So we'll let you slide on this little take, this little shot taken at the CoCo 1. The next item is from Josh Harper. Josh has been in the community a little while. He pops up once in a while. He has lists of things he's looking for that he'll post to the list once in a while. He also got a little dust up not too long ago where another list member kind of had mistaken him for a spammer or something. I don't know. I think we all felt sorry for Josh at that point. Anyway, Josh has been involved in a attempt to recreate the Mylar inserts that are part of the circuitry inside of the CoCo keyboards. A lot of keyboards of that vintage in retro computers have this plastic layer inside with a conductive traces on it that actually form the switches for the keys inside of the keyboard. And because of the nature of the construction there, the conductive traces sometimes will come off of the flexible plastic underneath and make the keyboards no longer work. So a number of the retro computing environments have come up with ways, basically sources for replacements of those Mylars. So you just take them out, take out the old Mylar, put in a new Mylar, and the keyboard works again brand new. So Josh is looking into that. He is posting some updates. Most of them are not super detailed, but basically just letting us know that he's still working with. He's got some kind of local company that is working with him on reproducing the Mylars, and so he posted an update to that effect. Let's see, when was this? November 18th, so last week or so. So, Josh, glad to hear that you're still pursuing this, and I look forward to seeing the Mylars hopefully before too long.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's definitely a good thing because finding replacement keyboards is going to get harder and harder these days.
Yeah, well, they're not making any more of them, that's for sure.
Apparently, talking to Boise, he did say that that is an issue. I've luckily never run across a keyboard that has that problem, but apparently it's definitely an issue.
Yeah, well, I've got a few keyboards that have random failures that I haven't bothered to track down because they have a certain job that the keys work well enough to do whatever it is they're supposed to do. And so I have a little travel pack for when I want to show Farfall or whatever else on the road for like a maker fair or a retro computing event or something. And so the CoCo 2 in there, as long as it runs Farfall, it doesn't really matter if all the keys work correctly. And I think maybe it may have a problem on the keyboard. And I might have a couple other machines that are in similar situations, but I'm not sure if those are Mylars or if there's something else wrong, because the PIAs inside can fail in odd ways, and sometimes they don't work. You can have broken circuit boards or other boards or whatever. Anyway, I'm sure the Mylars can wear out, and I'm sure there are people who would love to have replacements. Hopefully those will come. Okay, the next news items is from Steve McCoy. Steve has been working on getting a complete set of scans of the Hot CoCo magazines up at Color Computer Archive. And so this month he posted that he had finally gotten April of '84, which I guess was the last one he was looking for. And so Hot CoCo is available. It's a cool magazine from back in the day for covering the color computer. And so if you haven't checked out Hot CoCo previously, then you should go to Color Computer Archive and take a look. It's a lot of good content. Okay, the next couple items come from Simon Jonason. Simon, of course, has been doing some weird, wild stuff to the video display generator on the CoCo 2 and Dragon for some time, working towards doing some demo-style code for CoCo. And so he's posted a couple of interesting things recently that I'm not sure I have my head around exactly how they're working, but I know he's got them going. The first one is in semi-graphics mode. He's got a technique that lets him produce essentially a half pixel shift in semi-graphics mode. So, the data should just show a series of blocks stacked on top of each other, and instead he can shift them alternate lines or whatever. He can shift them over half a pixel or half a character, I guess is what he says. So they kind of look like they have fringe on them. It was basically the effect. It's an interesting effect. I'm not exactly sure what it would be useful for, but that's for the demo coder to figure out. But it's a neat effect, and it's CoCo doing something that's not documented on how to do. So it's great that Simon's been poking around and figuring out stuff like that. One other thing Simon's been doing, he's got another one here. It says 28 plus colors on the CoCo 2/Dragon. Probably should say on the PAL CoCo 2/Dragon. So basically, Simon has figured out something about the PAL video encoding that basically you can get a multi-line effect somehow. And again, I'm not sure I really totally understand how these are working just yet, but he's actually producing, on the emulator, it looks like you've just got kind of a candy stripe of two different lines. But then you show the pictures on a real television. Granted, they're tube television, so I don't know if there's a CRT effect involved or not. But one way or another, it mixes out and it looks like a smooth color instead of alternate lines. Like I said, he's getting up like 28-ish colors. That's a lot of colors to get out of the CoCo 1 or 2.
It looks amazing. Those pictures he posted, it's definitely really cool to see that.
Yeah, so that's pretty neat, and it's not difficult to see how you can use more colors, right? That's a neat idea.
I think it's safe to say that Simon is the CoCo demo scene guy.
Well, as of now, I'd say he's probably the only one doing that sort of thing. Anyway, so Simon's done some cool stuff. He's got some new graphics capabilities out there. If you want to see more, then contact Simon. He's both on Facebook, and he also hangs out over at the worldofdragon.org. But let him know what you think of his graphics and encourage him to keep going and produce us some cool demos. Okay, the next item comes from Chad Hendon. I think we mentioned Chad's part of his project in the earlier episode, although I think at that point I didn't know his last name, so he was just Chad H there. Anyway, so Chad he's working on a multi-ROM pack, it's CoCo 512K EEPROM with plus external controller. So he's got essentially a bank switched ROM pack, and he's got provisions for having an external, like an AVR or a PIC or something like that, with an LCD display to to take your selection of which ROM pack to load next, and then plus he's also got, along with that hardware, he's got some software. He's written some loaders and stuff. So in your ROM pack, you might not actually have a ROM image. You might have a image of a piece of disk-based software, but with a loader that lets it load out a ROM. He's doing some cool stuff. Anyway, he's put together a video showing how he's using his new hardware and software combination to be able to load code on the CoCo. I took a look at it. It's pretty cool. The link here is in the show notes. So if that sounds at all interesting to you, you definitely should avail yourself of the opportunity to watch Chad's YouTube video.
Cool thing about this project is you can take a disk image and convert it into something that can load off ROM. So it's not only good for archiving, but it makes the program run a lot faster.
Yeah, so it's a neat idea. And like I said, it's both software and hardware. He's done some write-ups or whatever. There's information out there. If you're interested on the technical aspects of Chad's project, he's documented a lot of it. And if there's something missing, I'm sure he'd really know. But I imagine that he'd be happy to hear from you, ask questions, and he'd probably be happy to fill you in. Moving on, the next project, the next piece of news comes from Nick Marentis. And so Nick is teamed up this time. Last time he was teaming up with Sockmaster. Now he's teaming up with Robert Galt. And these guys have put their heads together and observed that in Super Extended Color Basic, there are 4 H-screen modes. There's a 320 by 192 in 4 or 16 colors and a 640 by 192 in 2 or 4 colors. But they observed that, of course, the Gimme chip is capable of producing 200 or 225 lines of resolution, but for whatever reason, the basic H-screen values there have restricted to 192 lines. And so they wanted to be able to use BASIC to do the drawing of whatever they want to draw, but still have access to the higher resolution modes. And so they've gone through and done a little poking around and described what you need to do, what kind of patches you need to poke into the RAM-based version of Super Extended Color Basic to enable you to use these higher vertical resolution versions of those modes. It's not too bad. I mean, it's looks like 6 lines with 3 or 4 pokes per line. So it's 20 pokes, give or take, to activate these extended modes, so you get more lines to use or whatever. And then to prove the point, Nick has also gone on and written a sprite editor in BASIC using these new modes. And the sprite editor itself looks like a rather useful little piece of software for drawing a sprite, a moving graphic for like a game or something. And he's got not only the graphics editing portion there, but he also has ways that you can kind of designate groups of sprites as an animation sequence, and then you can see what it looks like when it's animated. So that's pretty cool. And he's got a really great write-up there on his project archive website. Like I said, a lot of cool stuff there. Have you checked it out, Neil?
I did. Actually, I checked it out today briefly. I loaded that sprite editor, and it's pretty easy to use. I might actually do a couple game graphics in it, or at least try.
Maybe you could do some game graphics of some Christmas-oriented sprites, and we could work together on some of that. So that should be cool. Next item is from Steve Batson, and he is announcing that California Digital, if you're not familiar with California Digital, this is a company that at some point back in the day acquired a large amount of Tano Dragons, and the Tano Dragon was essentially the Dragon 64 made for the U.S. market, so it has NTSC video. It was for a while sold by this company called Tano, which I think they were down in New Orleans. I'm pretty sure it was Louisiana one way or another. I think it was New Orleans. Anyway, I'm not sure really what happened to Tano. I think they may have actually been fundamentally more of an oil company. So they may have actually acquired the computers maybe for their own use in their oil business. I don't know. But California Digital, I guess at some point, I don't know the history there, but one way or another, they ended up with this stockpile of Tano Dragon machines, and they've been available for sale, new in the box, for years. And several of us have picked them up over time, and they still seem to have these machines.
It's like a time capsule over there.
It is. You can smell the air fresh from the 80s when you open the box. Anyway, Steve is letting us know that the California Digital people are pre-announcing a price increase. So right now, I guess you can get them for $49 each. And as of January 1st, 2016, they're going to be available at $59 each. I'd say it's still a pretty reasonable deal if you're looking for that kind of machine. I don't know. That was, of course, is followed up by some discussions on the mailing list of whether or not California Digital folks are particularly easy to work with. It sounds like it's maybe sort of a one-man shop and maybe not the most professional customer service or whatever. Considering the nature of what's for sale, I think probably that's not a huge surprise.
I could see how it would fool somebody, though. The name California Digital sounds like a big corporation.
It kind of does. I don't know. I don't know what their website has these days. They used to have a pretty big stock of various types of vintage gear, and I got the impression in the past, like say 15 years ago, that they were making money selling vintage gear to people who had to keep old systems alive. And whether or not there's anybody who had to keep an old set of Tano dragons alive anywhere, I don't know. That'd be an interesting story. Perhaps that business may have died off now or been replaced by some old hermit somewhere with a collection of Pentium machines running DOS 6. Who knows? So if you want to get a Tano Dragon from California Digital, and you want to keep the current price of $50, you may want to go ahead and send in your check by the end of the year. Along those same lines, I've thrown in one here that I thought was newsworthy. An eBay auction for a new old stock Tano Dragon 64, which, as we just sort of went over, a new old stock Tano Dragon is not exactly hard to come by. Anyway, it's an eBay auction for a new old stock Tano Dragon 64, sold for $173.50. So somebody apparently didn't know you could still buy these brand new for $50, and they got a little too excited on eBay and paid a bit more than what I think they should have paid. So, caveat emptor. Let the buyer beware. If you are looking at buying a Tano Dragon, there's probably better ways to get them than on eBay, and certainly better ways to get them than paying $175 on eBay. Well, okay, so one more news item. This one is just, I've watched this auction. Oh, it's been ended. Well, never mind.
Someone bought it?
Someone bought it.
Wow.
That's cool. Well, so I had this auction for 24, quote, TRS-80 Atari vintage computer games. Basically, it's 24 program packs, most of them in boxes, a few loose, and it included this hard-sided piece of luggage that looks like it came from the 60s that had all these stuffed inside. I had originally spotted it when they were asking $300 for it, and then they had, to their credit, they at least had dropped the price a bit and had gone down first to $250 and then to $230. And but as of yesterday, it had still been relisted at $230. Looks like somebody bought it. So I was basically posting it just to say, please, somebody buy this, just so I can quit seeing it. So whoever heard my unspoken prayer, thank you for buying that.
You know what I think sold it was that luggage.
It might be. It's kind of interesting to have that piece of luggage. I don't know. I mean, it's not a bad package. There's some nice titles in there. I mean, there's a Downland, there's a Panic Button, a Spider Side, Androne, there's an Atom, a Mind Roll. There's even a Math Bingo. I mean, that's pretty hard to come by right there. But Dragonfire, Demon Attack. There's some pretty good titles in there. Thought maybe it was a little bit much to ask. Maybe it finally got down low enough to wasn't quite so ridiculous. In fact, I think I said that yesterday that, well, at $10 a piece, maybe it's starting to become a reasonable price. But when it was at like $300 or something, I thought, well, that was a little much. Anyway, somebody bought it, so I guess I'll still leave that in the show notes since we mentioned it. But Anyway, well, that's my last item of news. So I guess now we'll just have to move on.
Some people have big plans after school. You know what Elliot's going to do? Jeff, too. Elliot's at work on a book report using Scripted on Radio Shack's Color Computer 3. It hooks up to his TV. And Jeff's at his Radio Shack Color Computer 3 playing the newest football game. But wait, what's Elliot doing playing New Super Pitfall? And Jeff's having a blast with a new math tutor. You never know what you might try with more than 100 programs for fun and learning. Radio Shack's Color Computer 3 comes with everything you see here. Other items each sold separately.
Only at Radio Shack.
Okay, let's have some listener feedback. First one is from John Strong, and it's in reference to, I mentioned in an earlier podcast that there was a way to get CoCo 2s as a kit, where you just get a box full of parts in the case, disassembled or whatever. You'd have to solder the parts on the bare motherboards, all that sort of thing. And so we've seen a few of those show up on eBay over the years, but it's pretty rare. Anyway, I mentioned that as earlier episode, and John wrote to us, says, I seem to recall the CoCo kits were not sold separately, but as part of a mail order training course. And so that kind of rings true. I could see where if there was an electronics course available either through Radio Shack or some subsidiary or their training facilities or whatever, that might have been the connection, where you probably couldn't just walk into the normal Radio Shack and buy a CoCo 2 kit. But if it was a training course, I could see where that might make sense. Wouldn't you think so, Neil?
Definitely. I mean, it would be a good learning experience. And I know this might be sacrilege, but I have to admit, if I ever came across that, I'd have to build it.
Yeah, I can definitely see that.
I don't know if I could keep looking at all those parts just looking at me. And I don't know. I just think it'd be a fun project. I know there's a lot of CoCo 2s out there, but the thrill of building it.
Yeah, it definitely would be cool. Anyway, if you happen to have one of these in your garage, feel free to contact me. I would be happy to help you find the proper disposition of that. Anyway, moving on. Next piece of feedback comes from Mike Rowan. He's a friend of the show, obviously. He sounds like he's vacationing with Neil these days. Anyway, so Mike says the show notes are great. So he's referring to starting with the previous episode, I think, switched the show notes to an HTML-based format, so it reads up like a web page. And then I actually created a little custom website for the show, a little more than just what it comes out stock from Cyber Years. So anyway, so that's what he's referring to as my HTML-based show notes. He says the show notes are great. I also enjoyed hearing everyone on Floppy Days episodes. And so if you're not aware, Floppy Days is another podcast, a retro computing podcast. It has a broad coverage of a variety of retro computing platforms. And he sort of walks through chronologically based on when computers were introduced. And so that's Randy Kidnig is the host, and Randy's also kind of part of the CoCo community. We see him on the mailing list from time to time. And Randy, I think he's planning to be at CoCo Fest this year, so at least he ought to be. I mean, he doesn't live that far away. So Randy, I'm calling you out. I expect to see you at CoCo Fest this year. Randy had some CoCo episodes recently. It's actually basically a 3-part thing. The first part was Floppy Days episode 44, where he had an interview with Boise Pete, which was sort of kind of a historical view on the CoCo. And then he had another interview, a different thing on episode 45, but 46 and 47, Neil and I joined Randy as co-hosts of Floppy Days for those episodes, and we had kind of a wide-ranging review of CoCo topics, from some of it more technical, some of it more kind of collecting. So anyway, if you aren't tired of hearing from Neil and I, and if you're interested in listening to another podcast, I would recommend you go and listen to Floppy Days, particularly episodes 44, 46, and 47. Do you have fun doing those episodes with Randy, Neil?
I did, and that's a lot of CoCo content, 3 episodes.
Yeah, there's only supposed to be 2, and Neil and I talked so much that he had to edit our 1 episode out to 2 more. instead. So Randy's a cool guy. He's also involved in the Antic podcast for the Atari, Boo Atari, 8-bit computers.
There's that name that came up again.
Atari.
Sorry, yeah.
Boo Atari. Anyway, no, actually, I kind of like the Atari, but Boo Atari just kind of rolls off the tongue, I guess. Anyway, moving on. So we mentioned the Dragon fellow goes by the name of Rollo, who's Roland Schweiger. He's a German fellow, and he produces a multi-ROM image cartridge so that you can. It's basically a multi-ROM pack, and so you can enjoy a number of ROM-based games on your CoCo or your Dragon. It sounds like he's targeting mostly the Dragon. He sent me a message that said that there aren't that many Dragon-specific ROMs, and so actually a lot of his ROM images on his cartridge are actually CoCo ROMs that he's had to hack a bit to work on the Dragon. Part of his message, he asked, is there anybody out there doing still some real productivity stuff, i.e. writing letters or controlling anything, maybe home automation? So I just would have to pass that question on along to you, the listeners. If you're doing anything cool with your CoCo, especially anything practical or real, running your weather station or running your home security system, or I don't know, running reports for your local book club, whatever. I'd love to hear about that. And it sounds like Rollo would too. How about you, Neil?
Yeah, same here. I find those stories fascinating when you run into somebody and you find out they're still using an old retro computer for their business. Or
yeah. Well, I recently discussed something that sort of falls into that. I mean, so the CoCo had the X10 controller. And, X10 is still sort of a thing. It's maybe not the coolest way to control lights and stuff in your house these days, but it still works. You were talking about maybe doing something with X10 recently. What was that?
I was thinking of doing controlling my Christmas lights with it.
Yeah.
The outdoor lights, the indoor lights, even the Christmas tree.
So that's cool. Yeah, I used to have the X10 controller hooked up to, just as sort of as for fun, I hooked it up to a bedside lamp in our bedroom, and I had it on a timer, and you can set it on a timer and it'll remember. I think you can set it on a timer and it'll keep the time even without the CoCo connected. And so I set it to come on in the evenings, 5 or 6 or whatever time it was getting dark. And then I kind of like to go to bed, and I don't know, between 10 and 11, and so I had it go off at, I don't remember, maybe 10:30. And my wife has always been one to stay up a little bit later, and so I'd go to bed and the light would go off, and half the time she'd kind of be caught still in the bathroom getting ready for bed. And so it got to be a bit of a silly game where she'd sort of race into bed at the last minute, see if she could beat the light going out. So that was fun. This is younger days, I guess. But anyway, it's not exactly what Rollo was asking about, but it's an amusing anecdote, I think. So moving on, another Dragon fellow, Per Surratt. I think Per, I'm trying to roll the R. I'm not very good at it, I think. But Per said he's from Barcelona, and that Per is a Catalan name for what it's worth. So I've been to Barcelona. I know something about the Catalonians, and that there's a bit of an independence movement there, to where Catalonia would like to be independent from the rest of Spain. Of course, I have some other Spanish friends who would be very tempted to let Catalonia find out what it's like to be independent from the rest of Spain. So they might have to be careful that they get what they wish for at some point. Hopefully I haven't angered Per with that. But so Per says, and so I think he's referring, Per's actually involved with that story we had earlier about running the Orchestra 90 ROM image on the Dragon. And he says, I'm afraid that this is a normal story. A Dragon user that discovers something really cool for the CoCo, and then something has to be programmed to use it in the Dragon. So, if the CoCo sometimes maybe feels a little bit unloved, certainly doesn't get the same amount of attention as the Apple II or even the Atari get. But, the Dragon, I think, is if we're in the shadow of the Apple II, the Dragon's actually in the shadow of the CoCo. So, if you are doing a project and want to do something cool, try to keep our Dragon brethren in mind and see if you can support them with your project. And at least maybe they don't have to hack the new stuff as much as they have to hack all the old stuff. I think that'd be cool.
Give your Dragon a little love.
Give your Dragon a little love. In fact, I mean, as we know, you can get a new in the box Dragon from California Digital. Price is about to go up. But you can still get them. So if you're a serious CoCo user, I'm not sure you can be serious as a CoCo user, but if you're a serious CoCo user, you should have a Dragon these days too, and make sure that all your projects work on both the Dragon and the CoCo. I think that'd be a good policy, don't you, Neil?
Yeah, for sure.
All right, cool. Well, that probably beats our feedback to death, but we would like to continue to hear from you. So please send us emails, your feedback on our shows, suggestions for new topics. I would really love to get some audio feedback. Record something, send it to us. Tell us what you think about the CoCo, what you think about our shows. Tell us about a project you're working on. We'd love to hear any of it, and we'll try to use whatever we can in the show itself, as long as you're not saying something crazy or vulgar.
I'm always looking for cool audio clips to put in the mix.
Cool. All right, well, that probably covers our feedback. This episode of the CoCo Crew Podcast is brought to you by the numbers 6, 8, 0, and 9, and the letter E. All right, welcome back. Past couple of episodes, we've added to our format to a discussion, free-form discussions between Neil and I. The reception seems to have been positive to that, so we thought it would be good to kind of continue that. In the spirit of Thanksgiving, though, I think we're going to avoid anything too controversial this time. Let's see how that goes.
We'll go on a lighter note.
Yeah, on a lighter note. Well, so Neil's job as the Canadian representative is to be the polite one in the group. And so we're letting Neil suggest the topic this time. And so Neil's suggestion, his original suggestion was, how many CoCos do you have? And I kind of steered that into what is in your CoCo collection, or maybe it's even just what's in your collection in general. So that's our topic. So I'm going to let Neil start with the discussion of, what is in your collection?
Well, definitely a lot of CoCos, but one thing I have a fetish for is collecting monitors and disk drives for the CoCo. And the only drawback with collecting those things, they do take a lot of room, but I just can't say no to a CRT monitor or old floppy drive. Had the need to save it.
Yeah, well, I can understand that to some degree. I mean, especially for different computers, sometimes even though the monitors can be compatible, they're compatible in a way that you got to find the right connector and rewire them yourselves, and maybe invert some signals. That can be difficult. So I've got a collection of monitors. I've got a monitor for an old Mac. I've got a monitor for the Apple II GS, which I'm pretty sure is different from the Mac. And then I've got the monitor. Well, it was for an MM1 actually, but also is a pretty decent, just 50 hertz or a 60 hertz, 15 kilohertz monitor for a variety of RGB uses.
That's very handy.
So you like floppy drives? You have. We have the different types of controllers too, or do you just have one?
Pretty much the whole, all the Radio Shack ones, like the FD 500, 501, 502, a couple of disto packs, J&Ms.
Yeah. You have the switchable J&Ms where you can...
I just recently got one, actually.
Yeah.
Switch the ROM, so I'm going to burn a different ROM so I can put 2 different DOSes in it.
Yeah, you have JDOS?
Yeah, JDOS, and I'll probably put ADOS on the other bank.
That used to confuse me, man. It's ADOS, JDOS, CDOS, RS-DOS. What is all this DOS?
And as for the floppy drives, themselves, I just I'm up to about 15 units now.
Ooh, they all half height, or any of them full height? Or?
Half height, some full height, mostly half height ones with the dual drives in them. Some I put in different drives like TX and then Panasonics.
Do you have any of those deck double? Well, they're double full height drive chassis. You've seen them at CoCo Fest a few times. Do you have one of those?
No, I don't. But I know what you mean.
Yeah, so I've got one. I remember it was really nice. It's real quiet and seemed pretty reliable up until the point where it stopped working. um, and I just I'm not sure why. When it stopped working, I just kind of threw it back on the pile. So I'll figure this out later, and then I've never gone back to it. But I think since then, I think I learned that the drives inside actually used belts to drive them rather than a lot of floppy drives. They have a direct drive motor or whatever.
That's right.
So these old ones, I think that these had a belt, and so I'm guessing that the belt broke, and that's why it doesn't work anymore.
Yeah, and that's very common. A lot of the even the full height drives, they're all belt driven, and it's tough finding a replacement belt for them. At least I haven't had good luck with it.
Yeah. I think there's probably some magic. You have to understand the terminology or whatever, exactly how to measure them or something. But it seems like it wouldn't be that hard. It's just a belt, loop around something. Is it tight enough? That sort of thing. But it can be a problem.
Do you have a Tomcat or an MM1?
I do not have a Tomcat. I would love to have one. I only know of about 3 or 4 of them that people have. I'm not sure how many were ever even made. I do have, I actually have 2 MM1s.
Wow.
But one of them I think was not fully populated. It was sort of like a starter model or something. And then the other one, I'd gotten from someone in the community, and then it had gotten jostled around or whatever. So the MM1 is just sort of just a little cage of cards or whatever. It's not really a cage. It's just sort of a backplane with some cards on it. Mm-hmm. And they kind of had jostled loose or whatever, and I didn't know much about how they were supposed to be, and so I kind of put them back together best as I thought they could be, and I think I got it wrong, and it kind of let the magic smoke out of something. So I have one that I think is damaged, but I haven't sorted that one out. I don't know. It's the MM1's an interesting little artifact from the past, and it's like, well, I'd hate to let it totally disappear and be destroyed, but I also can't give it a lot of priority because I never had one back in the day. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. So you don't have the attachment to it as much as.
Yeah, I'm not really attached to it. If there is anybody who's interested in a smoking MM1, feel free to contact me. I'm sure we could arrange something. So you're talking about you can't say no to a monitor or floppy drives, and I can sympathize with that, although I think I'm past that on the floppy drives and might be past that on the monitors these days. What I had trouble saying no to was the Deluxe RS-232 packs. And I guess because I used to do a lot of modem style communications, and I also like to use the serial ports for debugging and communicating to CoCo's sort of remotely. So I like to always make sure I have those packs available if I want to hook up to the CoCo. And then also I used to buy basically every Orchestra 90 pack I could find, but I finally got enough of those that I thought I was okay. And then I probably still buy the sound speech packs whenever they're kind of at a low price, if whatever low seems like at the time. But I probably have enough of those as well, so maybe I'll stop doing that. But those were favorites for me, and I'm not sure why. As you'd think you just buy one and be done, but I probably have at least 3 or 4 of each of those 3 packs.
It's interesting too. Me and Mike Rowan were talking about this, and how certain people get hung up on a certain item, and you buy more than you really need, but you just have that addiction, I guess.
Yeah, I definitely can understand that. Well, if there's some aspect of the CoCo that you really like, you want to make sure you never have to live without it, and especially if you're not technically inclined enough to replace or repair something, or if you are technically inclined enough to realize that it's made of a collection of unobtainable replacement parts. So if it ever breaks, you'll never be able to fix it. That's kind of how I am with the Vectrix. Those until recently, I thought the tubes were basically unobtainable, although that turned out to not be quite true, at least not for now. But yeah, sometimes it can be hard to find replacement parts for things. So what else? So how about some of the more esoteric things? Do you have the Real Talker or the ears, which is I guess you could respond to? You could actually recognize speech. Do you have either of those?
I don't have the ears, but I do have one Real Talker.
Yeah.
The ears is always that sounds pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think I have one somewhere in the pile, but I've never really used it. I was always kind of skeptical of any kind of voice activation stuff. I still am, even with cell phones to some degree. But I'm sure I picked it up as part of a deal somewhere. That's how I ended up with it. I doubt if I'd have negotiated for that individually. So what else? How about the video digitizer for the CoCo? Do you have any of those?
Yeah, I have a DS69. I just recently acquired that. Playing around with that, it's kind of neat. And I'm also lucky enough, I was trying to collect a lot of the Dicom products, partly because they were Canadian made, so it kind of got a little attachment for me there. And I was able to get the original light phaser adapter with the original games and the Rat mouse.
Oh, you got the mouse.
Which was also a Dicom product.
Oh, that's cool. I know you'd been looking for that. Yeah, the light phaser adapter is pretty cool. It sure is a shame how that technology is tied so strongly to CRT monitors. Because so the way that one works, you can see why it needs to be tied to a CRT monitor, because it kind of records the timing of when the signal hits the phaser to determine where on the screen you're pointing. But even on the Nintendo games, which use a slightly different technique, where when you press the trigger, they black the screen and then they draw a white box around each target to see if you hit. Theoretically, that technique should still work, even on that doesn't really depend on a raster scan for the technique, but it turns out that it expects that response quickly enough that modern televisions, because they do processing on the video, they end up not showing the white block for the targets fast enough for a Nintendo game to recognize the hit. And so even though that technique should have been sort of future-proof, it still wasn't.
In certain ways, the CRTs were ahead of their time.
So the CRT actually provides faster performance on video output. Kind of strange. If you ever hear somebody say, well, there are still video applications that require CRT, well, that's partly why, because they actually control the timing of when the video shows up more easily on the CRT. Kind of weird, huh?
Yeah, that is. The other thing I like about retro computing is you don't have to worry about updates. The line of work I do, the updates just drive you crazy.
Yeah.
The other day I was doing a Windows 7 machine, and 3 hours later, just to do one set of updates. So anybody telling you it takes a long time to load a game off a floppy disk, well, you know what?
Wait until you download it over the internet, right?
That's right.
Oh, man. Well, here's kind of along the same lines, really. Here's something I'll bet you don't have.
Okay.
This is 2002 by Nick Marentis and John Kowalski, a.k.a. Sockmaster. This is the DigiWiper. Are you familiar with that one?
I've seen it on his webpage.
So it's a cool little project. He basically uses an LM1881, which is a sync separator, and to sync up with a video signal that's passing through. So like you'd have a video source passing through to a VCR, passing through this little box that's plugged into the CoCo. And then it's got software that lets you do wipes. So like if you're doing editing on a VCR or whatever, and you want to transition from one scene to another, you can do a wipe, left to right or top to bottom or corner to corner, that sort of thing, or jail bars even.
That's cool.
Yeah, it's a cool little piece of technology. I mean, it's sort of been bypassed by the fact that nobody is using analog video anymore. So it's kind of in the same category as, say, the video toaster on the Amiga, which is a cool piece of technology that now is practically useless, right. Certainly obsolete. But it's a cool little piece of technology. If you are using those composite video sources, you can throw in these wipes or fades or whatever, and I'm sure there's not too many of them out there. I
I was just going to say, there's probably only made a handful of them. I don't think they sold a lot.
Yeah, I was under the impression they didn't sell very many, maybe on the order of a dozen. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But anyway, I've got one. It's a pretty cool little piece of tech. I've considered trying to sell it just to see how much it would go for, but I don't know. I kind of like it.
Yeah, I was just saying that's a neat piece to own.
How about, so what else have you got that might be interesting?
A white CoCo 1.
Yeah, you got a white one? Yeah, I've got a white one down in a box somewhere.
The white CoCo 1 was neat. All of them came with 64K of RAM and extended color.
Yeah, I think they were all, I think that was in the era of the deluxe CoCo, which got canceled, but then they still kind of had a market for a tricked out CoCo, and sort of a higher end CoCo before the CoCo 2.
I always found that fascinating that the CoCo 1, the white one, came with 64K extended color basic, and then yet the Color Computer 2 came out. You can get it with just regular basic and 16K.
Yep. Well, I wonder also, I guess since it's a CoCo 1, it probably has the 12 volts on the cartridge port.
It does. I tested it with an old disc controller.
Yeah, so I wonder if that's just sort of to fulfill the CoCo Power user market as the CoCo 2 was coming out.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Anyway, that's kind of cool. Do you have a TDP 100?
No, I wish I did. I saw one at VCF Midwest this year, but price was too high. It was pretty beat up.
Yeah, I've got one that got a few mods on it, which on the one hand I like because they're convenient and it's kind of cool. On the other hand, I kind of wish it was more pristine, but it's kind of cool.
Yeah, some mods could be really good.
Okay, well, let me trump you with one more thing there. How about a Videotex terminal? Do you have one of those?
No, I don't have one of those.
Pretty useless, I guess, but it's kind of cool to see that heritage, that CoCo heritage. Obviously, it's the same case as the CoCo 1. It even has the kind of a knockout where the cartridge port should be.
If you're opening up a CoCo museum, that's definitely a good piece to have. That's part of the family.
It definitely is. It's sort of the pre-CoCo world. I think it'd be cool. I should at some point try to crack that open and see if I can put a ROM socket on there somewhere and run some code on that. That'd be kind of cool.
See if there's a solder pads for the cartridge port.
Oh, that might be neat.
So we can solder one on.
It'd be funny if they had the same motherboard, but I'm sure it doesn't because it has the modem on board, right? But anyway.
If you really want to be a completist, you got to get Project Green Thumb.
That would be awesome. Good luck finding one of those. I'm not even really sure what they'd look like. But no, the closest I ever came to that, I remember, and it was years ago. You'd think I'd have seen another one by now, but it basically looked like a blue CoCo 2, or I'm sorry, a blue CoCo 1, and it was an Ag Vision terminal. And so I think it's basically the same. I think it's basically the same thing as the Videotex terminal.
Okay.
And so it was like a step in between. It was after Green Thumb. And about the same time, or maybe slightly before the Videotex terminal, there was this thing called Ag Vision. There probably, if there's 5 Green Thumbs still out in the world somewhere, there's probably 100 Ag Visions still out in the world somewhere. And even those numbers are probably optimistic, but just scale wise, you know what I mean? There's probably a lot more Ag Visions available than Green Thumbs. There's probably 1 Green Thumb and 20 Ag Visions or something. And I don't know. I'm totally making these numbers up. But, I saw a quote from George Washington that said that 95% of statistics on the internet are all made up. Anyway, I know something. I've got software that you'd like to have. I've got my original Gantlet disc I got from Mr. Glenn VDB.
And that is a Dicom product.
Yes, it is. Practically comes with a Canadian flag. Oh yeah, well there is that ROM pack too, right?
The burner,
not the ROM burner. Yeah, you ended up with the ROM burner from Glenn, and
then it magically appeared at your house.
Yeah, you'd somehow decided I needed it, so that's the Intronics EEPROM burner. and it's a cool little piece of tech. I like it because it's the software is just built into the ROM that plugs in with it.
Didn't you find a manual for that?
Yeah, I was going to say, I was after you sent that to me, I was looking through an old collection of documentation, manuals, and magazines and stuff like that. I was kind of sorting through that I had acquired over the years, and I found a bound copy of the manual for the Intronics EEPROM burner. So it was like fate.
That was meant to be.
It was meant to be. So pretty cool stuff there. Everybody should have a CoCo buddy that sends them stuff once in a while.
That's a nice little surprise in the mail.
Yeah, it was cool. Along with my contraband chocolate and my Mars bar. For those outside the U.S., you may not realize that the Mars bar is something that we don't have in the U.S. And so Neil was kind enough to send me one because I've acquired a taste for them in my travels abroad. Although, to be honest, they're not that different from a Milky Way. But anyway, well, that's probably, we're starting to ramble now, I guess. So maybe we should wrap this up. But anyway, a friendlier or less controversial host discussion segment this time, but I hope it's still enjoyable for everyone. Moving on.
And at that note, we'll leave you with this. It's not hoarding if you have everything organized and you know where it is.
Which is, of course, means that I'm hoarding.
Okay, but why Tandy computers? In a word, quality. We do it all, from custom-designed semiconductors to the finished product. Tandy business computers are manufactured in our own USA plants. We test and retest and test again to ensure one of the highest standards of quality in the industry. And Radio Shack provides total service and support. I'm convinced.
Tandy Computers at Radio Shack Computer Centers. In business, for business.
Okay, welcome back. This is the sixth part of our CoCo architecture series. In the earlier parts, we focused mostly on the individual chips that made up the CoCo 1 and 2 architecture, and we talked about the cartridge port. Pretty much covered the CoCo 1 and 2, so now we're going to have to talk about the CoCo 3. And the CoCo 3, of course, is mostly compatible with the CoCo 1 and 2, so it sort of starts with that base architecture. And then it builds upon it, mostly with an ASIC, an application-specific integrated circuit made for the CoCo 3, known as the GIME, G-I-M-E, which stands for Graphics Interrupt Memory Enhancement, or enhancer. I'm not sure I know what exactly the ending on that last word, but GIME, so it's Graphics Interrupt Memory and Enhancement, or something like that. Most of the differences, we're going to talk mostly about the GIME because most of what makes a CoCo 3 different from a CoCo 1 or 2 is in the GIME chip. There are a few other physical differences, so I'll just go ahead and cite them. The keyboard on the CoCo 3 has a few extra keys. It has the arrow keys relocated, and it has a couple of function keys and whatever. But it's a similar keyboard, but there's a couple of extra keys on there. On the bottom of the CoCo 3, there's a little 10-pin header that is for an RGB monitor port, specifically for the CM8, although it can be interfaced to other similar monitors. There is on the back, in addition to the RF video output, there's also a composite video output port, and of course a matching RCA audio connector. It's a little, you can't really see the difference from the outside, but there is a 6th pin on the joystick connector that on the CoCo 1 and 2 is ostensibly unused, although it looks like some of them may actually have tied it to ground. But on the CoCo 3, that 6th pin on the joystick is used to enable a second joystick button. So that's cool for a little extra action control in a number of games. That's pretty much it from the outside. It otherwise looks pretty similar to a CoCo 2. I guess the keyboard bezel is gray rather than black. It's kind of a little bit of a difference. Like I say, a few extra keys. Otherwise, it's a little bit hard to tell the CoCo 3 from the CoCo 2. Of course, the badge on top says Color Computer 3 128K, unless, of course, you buy one of the new badges from Boise. But that's a separate story. All right, we'll talk some now about the history. When it was time to start considering the Color Computer 3, of course, people were realizing that the Color Computer and Color Computer 2 was getting a little bit, as they say, long in the tooth. The other competing machines were more powerful graphically and often more powerful audio as well. The CPUs for the traditional competitive machines weren't really getting any better, although you're starting to see the 16-bit CPUs become more prevalent, the 68,000, that sort of thing. But I think the biggest weak point, as always, had been on the CoCo, had been graphics. So I think that was the focal point for looking at enhancements. Motorola at the time had a chip called, a chipset actually called the RMS, which I think is Raster Management System. I think it's 2 chips. Anyway, the specs, I don't really have a complete set of specs, but I know it could display 64 out of 4,096 colors and had higher resolutions and such. Kind of put it on par with, say, the Amiga in terms of raw specs. I'm not sure about how it would have played out in terms of number of sprites you could draw and that sort of thing. But anyway, it was a big enhancement, and it was off the shelf, which would have been kind of a typical Tandy way to go. Unfortunately, the story is the story is detailed in Bill and Boise's book, CoCo: The Colorful History of Tandy's Underdog Computer. The story is kind of detailed there, so if you really want the historical play-by-play, then look at there. But basically, I guess it came down to, there are a few complaints listed in there. Some of them seem a little questionable to me. One about that somehow the way the chip managed memory wasn't really compatible with OS 9, although it didn't look terribly different to me than how any other chip would manage memory. There was a complaint about it being slow, which seems maybe a little more plausible. It says that 0.89 megahertz was the max, although it probably is on the CoCo. It's probably more like 1 megahertz would be the max in general, since it was a generic chipset. It could be, I don't know. It's not unreasonable to think that there were speed limitations, but I think the biggest problem was that it was expensive, and it's cited as $20 for a chipset, which doesn't sound all that impressive, but if you're involved in any kind of manufacturing, especially electronics or whatever, you'll know that the bill of materials cost kind of factors into an equation or whatever that the manufacturers will use, and they'll put a big multiplier on it and say, well, for every dollar we add to the cost, it costs us $100 in support or something like that. I don't know what the real numbers are, but $20 for a computer is going to sell for $219. $20 a cost for a single item probably was a pretty big concern. So there's a Tandy engineer named John Prickett who, there's more information about John in Bill and Boise's book if you want to learn more about Mr. Prickett and his career. But anyway, John Prickett decided that offered to do an ASIC design in-house, and that he could do it for a lot cheaper. And the long story short, I guess when they did produce the Gimme chip, production cost is cited as $7. So that's a lot cheaper. That's about almost a third, or a little more than a third. But it's a pretty good delivery of bang for the buck, I would say. It may or may not have Obviously, it didn't meet the color specs, and I don't know about the other specs of the RMS, but still a pretty good chip for a much more reasonable price. The CoCo 3 was unveiled on the 30th of July, 1986, at the New York Waldorf Astoria Hotel. A glittery event, I'm sure. Side note is apparently the infamous Mr. Bill Gates was in attendance. Microsoft wasn't quite the behemoth then as it is now, and certainly as the provider of the BASIC in the machine, I guess Mr. Gates thought it was worthwhile for him to come and attend the event. A couple of months later, in October, there was a Rainbow Fest in New Jersey. And there was a roundtable discussion held there about the CoCo 3, and it included Barry Thompson, who was the Tandy internal buyer for the CoCo 3. So kind of like so I think that's sort of what you might call a PM in a lot of companies these days, a product manager. And then there's Mark Siegel, who was, well, of course, he was maybe more of a product manager. I don't know. Anyway, Mark Siegel was definitely involved in the management side of the project, and the infamous Mr. Steve Bjork was there as representing the developers for the CoCo 3, and there may have been a few other people on stage. I don't know. The audio of that event actually is available, or at least some of the audio of it. And I'll put a link in the show notes for those that are interested in hearing what people were talking about there, and it's kind of funny. Some of the a few jokes in there that are a little, maybe not risque, but maybe a little sexist or whatever by modern standards. So it's definitely a period piece. One other note that I noticed that's sort of a historical interest is about the name, the GIME, or Graphics Interface Memory Enhancement. That name is well, it's mentioned in, I think they used that in that roundtable discussion, and it's in the Rainbow Magazine articles about the unveiling of the CoCo 3. But if you read in the technical reference manual and some of the other literature related to the CoCo 3, it refers to the ACVC, or the Advanced Color Video Chip. Going by some of the information in that roundtable discussion, it sounded like maybe there was a work conflict with the technical writers involved with the CoCo 3, and that maybe that some of the technical documentation didn't get produced until later. So I don't know if there was an official name change from GIME to ACVC internal to Tandy, or if somehow it just didn't get communicated correctly to the writers. But you will see that in some of the technical documentation. It'll reference what is clearly the GIME chip, and they'll refer to it as the ACVC. So if you're ever poking around, say in the technical reference manual or service manual for the CoCo 3, you'll see that. Anyway, so usage of the chip. Obviously, it was used in the Tandy CoCo 3, and not surprisingly, it wasn't really used in much else, although somewhat surprisingly, it was actually used in the Frank Hogg Labs TC9, or Tomcat. And this was one of the machines that came along later at the end of the CoCo's commercial life, that was sort of billed as a CoCo 4. And my understanding is Frank Hogg actually bought up a stock of GIME chips and was popping them in his own design. I don't know a lot about that, but it's kind of an interesting footnote. After these messages,
we'll be right back.
All right, well, now with most of the historical bits taken care of, we can look at some of the features of the GIME chip and the CoCo 3 in general. The main point, of course, is compatibility. The CoCo 3 is supposed to be compatible with the CoCo 1 and 2. If you listen to the roundtable recording that I mentioned earlier, they will emphasize again and again how compatible it is and how everything's going to work as long as you follow the rules or whatever. I suspect the rules were a bit fluid. But anyway, so for the most part, the CoCo 3 is compatible with the CoCo 1 and 2. The biggest outlier to that is the support for the semi-graphics modes. The CoCo 3 really only supports one semi-graphic mode from the 6847. That's SG4. That's the one that divides every character into 4 blocks. On the CoCo 1 and 2, well, just straight out of the 6847, of course, there was an SG6 mode that was a little bit broken on the CoCo because of the way they had reused some of the data lines to in the text modes for indicating upper and lower case, that sort of thing. Limits the amount of colors available in SG6 mode, so I guess I decided it just wasn't going to be used at all for the CoCo 3. It's a shame, I think, that they left out the SG 8, 12, and 24 because those are very useful modes and can produce some pretty nice graphics overall. Of course, the CoCo 3 has no use for those. It can actually produce a lot nicer graphics, but it'd be nice if your CoCo 2 games that written in the semi-graphic modes, say Farfall, would continue to work on the CoCo 3, but alas, that's not what they did. There's some evidence that perhaps they did try to support them and for whatever reason just couldn't get them working or decided to stop before they got them working. There are some pokes you can do. I'm not going to document them here, but there are some pokes that will allow you to turn on most of the semi-graphics mode functionality on the CoCo 3. Unfortunately, it still is a little broken when it comes to showing text mode. Anyway, so the CoCo 3 is mostly compatible with the CoCo 1 and 2. I guess that's your takeaway item. And that also includes some of the extended features available from the later VDG, the 6847 T1. So things like being able to have a black background in the graphics modes or true lowercase. Those are able to be chosen the same way on a CoCo 3 and running as a CoCo 2 as they would be done on a CoCo 2 equipped with that chip. There are a few timing differences in the way the graphics are implemented. So if you have a program that tries to sort of race the beam, shall we say, while drawing VDG graphics, it'll show up a little bit differently on the CoCo 3. Historically, I think this was only the Dragonfire cartridge. Also, the code from my VDG Tricks blogs does some of that. I haven't really tried that on the CoCo 3, but I suspect that they will not look quite right on the CoCo 3. But, you know, if you, like I say, if you were following the rules and playing nice with the graphics hardware, then it still should look nice on the CoCo 3. There are a couple of gimme registers that are still active even in the CoCo 1 and 2 mode, or bits really of registers. These include the VRES 1 and 0 and the HRES 2 bits, and as well as a horizontal offset, I think. So basically what this means is you can kick the CoCo 1 and 2 into a 64 character wide display mode. You can also enable more lines per screen, up to 16 or 17 lines. I mean, it's not a lot, but you can, I guess you can go up to 19 lines. Anyway, the use of this is questionable. If you're going to mess around with code like that, you might as well switch it into the CoCo 3's modes and use them sort of as intended, but they're there, and if you see use for them, then I'd love to see what you come up with. One final note on the CoCo 1 and 2 compatibility mode is the color selection is actually implemented by forcing the selection of certain palettes for certain things. And so this allows you to do some manipulations, and if for some reason you don't like the colors that they've decided to map the original VDG colors to, you can change them in the palette registers. You can swap them around. One thing that's common is the artifact modes don't display correctly on the RGB monitor. So what can be done is you can run a program that manipulates the graphics modes to one of the 4 color modes, and then sets up the palette registers to map to the black, white, red or orange and blue colors that are common for the artifact-based games. There also are, it's not really limited to that. You can do a number of manipulations on the different colors if you don't like them to display the way they've been displayed. I think maybe Nick Morentis is doing this in his Donut Dilemma game when it detects it's running on a CoCo 3. I think it might change some of those P-mode graphics palette choices to something a little easier on the eyes. So anyway, the takeaway is the CoCo 3 is largely CoCo 1 and 2 compatible, not completely compatible, and if you have some code that is mostly CoCo 1 or 2 compatible but could stand a few tweaks, there might be some things you could do on the CoCo 3. I'm in love with the CoCo. So with the compatibility talk out of the way, let's move on to some of the more visible, perhaps the most visible parts of the capabilities in the gimme. So we'll talk about some graphics. Obviously, one of the big highlights for the CoCo 3 is the fact that it could display up to 16 colors out of a total palette of 64 colors available. So finally, the color computer actually has some color behind it. And it wasn't even totally behind the times when it came out, although probably still not exactly cutting edge. Anyway, so there's there's 16 palette registers, each with 6 bits, 2 bits each of red, green, and blue that you can specify what RGB colors that you want. There's also a border control register with the same style of mapping, 6 bits. Something that's a little weird about the palette registers on the CoCo 3, you use the same palette registers, of course, perhaps, whether you're dealing with RGB output or composite video output, which composite video output is on NTSC systems, the composite video output is a bit different. So the exact same bit values come out of the register, but they get interpreted in a different way. And so rather than being the 6 bits of red, green, and blue, they are it's 4 bits of basically a hue value. So it's really a direction or on a color wheel. So it's 4 bits of hue and 2 more bits that are a combination of brightness and saturation. The takeaway there is that the program has to know if it's running on composite video, NTSC composite video, or RGB, because the palette values are different. Either that or the program has to not really care that the colors are going to be different. So you will get a different display literally at the same time. You'll get a different color displayed versus your composite video output and your RGB output if you were to run them both at the same time, which you can do. The color displayed on the RF output will match what's on the composite video output, because the RF is basically just a composite signal modulated over a radio carrier. That's a little strange. I think probably what was more common then, and certainly what I would have thought they would have done, would to just use RGB and then have a chip at the end of the video chain that would take the RGB color and convert them to a composite color signal at the very end, but they didn't do that. I guess they're probably looking to save, the 50 cents whatever. I know they're pretty cost conscious. I have no idea what the chip really cost back then. I don't think it's particularly expensive, but they could have used a chip that would have converted the colors, but for whatever reason they didn't. So that's a little sideline, and that's why you have to specify in so many programs whether you have a composite monitor or an RGB monitor, is because they're going to write a value to the same register that has to be different, a different value depending on what kind of monitor you're using. So beyond the palette registers, the graphics hardware, of course, includes the text modes. There were text modes for 32 columns, 40 columns, 64 columns, and 80 columns. So the 32 and 64, along with being more convenient for binary math, are probably legacy modes, essentially, dating back to the original CoCos. And then 40 and 80. 80 had become a standard by then, I think, for viewing text on the computer screens. 40 would have been sort of an earlier compromise that a lot of systems had supported 40 columns because you could actually read them on a television at 40 columns, but not at 80 columns. So it probably just made sense to support 40. The CoCo 3, which could support the text mode, the CoCo 3 specific text modes could support 24, 25, or 28 text lines with variable character heights. And so you could make the characters bigger. So in the 24 line base mode, you could make the characters bigger so that you could get either 24 or 21 or 19 or 17 and a half characters per line. And so then commensurately you get that many more lines with the larger line modes. I don't know, you'd have to work it out, but suffice it to say there's a fair amount of flexibility in how the characters were displayed. There were modes, both you could have just both a plain text mode and just specify the character value, or you could specify an attribute mode where you could specify a second byte per character, and they had bits for supporting blink or underline, and then they had 3 more bits for foreground modes and 3 more bits for colors, 3 bits for foreground colors and 3 bits for background colors. And then, that would only be, that'll only give you 8 choices per. So out of the 16 registers, what they did is basically said the first half is for, I think, for foreground, maybe for background. I'm not sure which off the top of my head, but basically foreground came from one half of the registers and background came from the other half of the registers. And so I guess this lets you have be similar to those two, having different intensities or whatever, or just completely different colors, whatever you wanted. Moving on to the bitmap graphics, there are a number of resolutions available. You could have a mode that supported either 128 or 64 pixels in either 2 or 4 colors. So that's probably 16 bytes per line. You could move that up to 20 bytes per line for 160 or 80 pixels in either 2 or 4 colors. Move that up to 32 bytes per line, so you could have 256, 128, or 64 pixels in 2, 4, or 16 colors. Then 40 bytes per line, so that's 30, 20, 160, or 80 pixels in 2, 4, or 16 colors. So each one of these moves up to a larger number of bytes per line. So you go to 512, 256, or 128 pixels in 2, 4, or 16 colors. And again, that's 64 bytes per line, I guess. Let's see. 640, 320, or 160 pixels in 2, 4, or 16 colors. And I guess those first two are the H-Screen 3 and H-Screen 1 equivalents. So 640 by 2 colors is H-Screen 3, and 320 by 4 colors is H-Screen 1. Let's see, there's a 1024, 512, or 256 pixels at 2, 4, or 16 colors, and a 1280 that's probably at 128 bytes per line. And so then a 1280, 640, or 320 pixels at 2.4 or 16 colors. So that's at 160 bytes per line. And so the 640 and the 320 of those represent HScreen 4 for the 640 and HScreen 2 for the 320. So that's a lot of different resolutions there. Some of them seem a little questionable and useful. I mean, who really needs 1280 horizontal pixels when you're going to have a maximum of 225 vertical? It seems a little weird. I'm sure you can make some use of it. I have my theories. I'll maybe touch on them a little bit later, why that was really there. But anyway, it's there. If you think you can make use of it, go for it. Vertical resolutions, you could have 192, 200, or 225 lines. The 192 lines is used for those various HScreen values. The others are not used by BASIC. There is a third setting in that register. There's 2 bits defined. So there's one that was originally for 210 lines, which apparently either doesn't work or requires a lot of trickery to make it somewhat work or whatever. I don't know. So either there's some stuff that was broken and never got fixed in the gimme, or maybe there's some hidden modes there that we just don't know how to use. It's ripe for speculation. Alright, so scrolling is another nice feature of the graphics on the gimme. You can do vertical scrolling by setting the start of the buffer. So you can just say, hey, start at this byte for the top of the buffer. You can do that up to 8 byte boundaries, so you can move down 8 bytes at a time, which is more than enough to move down a line by line, and position it almost anywhere in memory you want. Like I said, it has to be on an 8 byte boundary. You can do horizontal scrolling in 2 byte increments, so you get basically a 128 bit offset, and it represents 2 bytes each, so total of 256 bytes for your scrolling. There's a mode to enable that so that each line of graphics data, instead of when you get to the end of the line, instead of going to the very next byte, it kind of rounds up to a 256 byte boundary before fetching the first bit of the next line. So anyway, that's a cool thing that's used for scrolling and panning, basically. And that way you can do a certain amount of that movement without having to redraw everything. In text mode, there is a line-by-line vertical smooth scrolling available, so you can basically tell the character generator to move up by a line. And I don't know how useful this is, but if you ever see text that just smooth scrolls up, it's instead of jumping up line by line as it scrolls off the screen, it kind of looks like you're moving a piece of paper up the screen. That's what it's for. It was a pretty popular thing to do at one point, maybe still is. Questionable value, perhaps. Not a very game thing. Let's put it that way. A few more missed points related to graphics. You can force a monochrome setting, which basically says this is only for black and white, and so not only does that of course affect RGB, but it will also affect the composite. It's probably more for affecting the composite and RF modes. And so what this does is actually turns off the color burst signal, so it disables the artifact colors, so that whereas normally, we're used to specifying a black and white mode and then getting artifact colors out. If you set this bit to monochrome only, you'll only get black and white. So that helps you get kind of a crisper picture in black and white if that's what you really intend to get. There is a bit that's used for selecting between 50 and 60 hertz vertical refresh. Presumably this is used for supporting PAL and perhaps CCAM video. Not much to be said about it. It might, in some cases, if you have a monitor that will support 50 hertz, there might be a reasons to turn on 50 hertz because it gives you a little bit more time per frame for processing. I don't know. It may or may not be useful to you, but In some cases, those extra few lines of processing while trying to synchronize for a frame can be helpful. One other note is on the PAL-based color computer 3s, even though they had a composite video output, that came separate. That was separate and distinct from the composite video output from the Gimme. And so I assume that the Gimme's composite video outputs just were not hooked up. And the PAL color computer 3s actually had I think a separate circuit board that connected to the RGB video output. And like I said, they could have used a chip. So on PAL, they did use a chip that would convert the RGB color information to a PAL signal and output PAL video that way. So causing the question why there was any composite video stuff on the Gimme at all, I don't know. Maybe it was done maybe there was a good reason, or maybe it was just sort of done in the seat of the pants kind of way without thought about PAL. Certainly didn't think quite as much about international business back in the day, although I think Tandy probably would have been thinking about that. I don't know. It's a weird oddity. Anyway, that pretty much covers at least the highlights of the graphical capabilities of the Gimme.
Hi, I'm Kevin Savitz of Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. You're listening to the CoCo Crew. When you're ready to play with a real computer, play with an Atari.
Moving on, let's talk about the I in Gimme, which stands for interrupts. So the CoCo 3/Gimme supports, of course, the same basic sources of interrupts that were available on the CoCo 1 and 2. So that's the vertical sync and horizontal sync and the cartridge port. Not a lot to be said about that, except that these values are being generated separately and distinctly from the PIAs. There's, in addition to those interrupt sources on the CoCo 3, there's also a keyboard interrupt source. Also can cover the joystick buttons. Apparently the original 86 version of the Gimme had some sort of bug related to the keyboard interrupt, so maybe not the best thing to rely on if you're writing code, unless you know exactly what your code's going to run on. But anyway, it is there. There's also an interrupt source available through the serial port. So presumably, so back in the time when the CoCo 3 was released, modeming was a very popular computer hobby activity. So serial port performance was an important thing because time is money, and especially when you're on a long distance phone call. So supporting a higher speed serial port probably seemed like a very important thing to do. I don't know how well that interrupt source works, but it probably doesn't hurt. Let's put it that way. What I think is probably the most important new interrupt source on the Gimme is that there's a high resolution timer available. So you have a timer and can select between two timing sources. One's either, I have it as 279.365 nanoseconds, or the other is, I have it as 63.695 microseconds. So two different granularities. Note also that a lot of the literature, the technical literature around the Gimme says that the faster one is 70 nanoseconds, but it does not seem to be the case. So I'm not sure how that little error slipped in, but Sockmaster's reference and my own experience with writing the CoCo 3 video player suggests that that 279 nanoseconds is the correct number. Anyway, the timer source is one timer source, and especially a countdown timer. So you write a value to it, and then every time one of those, you select which one of those clock sources you want, and then every time that clock, cycles, it counts down your timer, and when it hits 0, it'll pop the interrupt. So that's a nice feature to have. It's probably the best use I know of it for, in a general sense, is to use it for playing audio. And it's a very nice way because you can reroute it. You can route it to the fast interrupt, fast IRQ source, and play audio with it. It's It's a pretty cool thing to do. And so you can actually have in-game music on the CoCo 3 a lot easier than you can on a CoCo 1 or 2. So as I kind of alluded to there on the Gimme chip, all of these interrupt sources can be routed to either the IRQ signal or the FIRQ signal. So if you have something that's going to fire a lot, like that high resolution timer for using audio, you can hook that to the fast IRQ source. And then if you have something slower, whatever's hooked up to the card, or maybe your incoming serial port, or I don't know, joystick presses, whatever, you can hook those up to the IRQ signal and process your interrupts as you wish. So that's a nice feature. One other point, the Gimme interrupts are actually run in parallel to the CPU interrupt lines, in parallel with the outputs from the original PIAs. So they're still out there. They're still out there trying to generate IRQs from HSync or VSync if you've told them to do so, or FIRQs from CART, and I guess it was CD or something that it was hooked up to. Anyway, they're still out there, and they can still hold the interrupt lines however they want. So if you're writing interrupt code on the CoCo 3, you need to make sure that you're accounting for what the PIAs are doing, and so that you don't enable an interrupt source that you don't want. And if for some reason you do want to use the PI interrupts and not the Gimme interrupts, that's an option. I'm not sure why you would want that, but maybe it's your code. Do it how you want. Anyway, I think that pretty much covers the interrupts on the Gimme. Another major feature of the Gimme is the M part, is the memory mapping. A lot of the literature refers to it as an MMU, or memory management unit. I think computer architecture has advanced beyond the mid-'80s to the point where when you say an MMU, you're kind of implying something a bit more advanced than what's on the CoCo 3. You're kind of implying something with a certain amount of memory protection and features related to that. So what we really have is a bank switcher. So you have a number of registers that you can write out basically the top parts of addresses to use, so that when you access a certain 8K range, it'll go and pop on use that 6-bit value as the top of the physical address range, and so that everybody can have their own address space, whoever's running, whatever task is running at the time. So the memory is divided into 8K banks, and so then you have 8 6-bit bank selects active at any time. And then there's actually 2 task sets available, so you can easily switch between 2 complete sets of bank selects with just a flip of a bit. So that's useful for when you have an operating system versus a user task like in OS 9, or Fuzzix or whatever you're running. You can easily switch the memory mapping with just a flick of a bit between the system and the running application. But like I said, there's no memory protection. A task can change its own memory mapping settings whenever it wants, and in so doing can clobber memory or whatever. So you still have to be kind of aware of the system, and if you are trying to run with different tasks, different processes, code developed separately, then they have to respect each other's boundaries. Because again, there's no memory protection available through the Gimme, and of course no support in the 6809 for it anyway. The Gimme can support mapping modes, so that you can support up to a 32K cartridge ROM. The original CoCo 1 and 2 I guess could only support 16K's worth of cartridge ROM. And let's see, in the CoCo 1 and 2, the SAM would reserve FFOO through FFFF for I/O. The Gimme supports adding to that also FEOO to FEFF, so you can have an extra 256 bytes of I/O reserved if you want. I'm not sure if anything actually makes use of that, but it's there if you need it. And then one more thing is the spare cartridge select, that FF40 select that the SAM provides. That can be turned off in the gimme. Again, I'm not entirely sure why that's useful, but somebody must have thought it would be useful for something. So if anybody knows how that's used, I'd love to hear it. So there's the I and the M, and E is for enhancements, but I'm going to call it extras. So I've got a few more extra bits to cover here. So there have been prototypes of the CoCo 3 that have been shown at the CoCo Fest. These were the machines that were actually delivered by Tandy to Microware to assist in development of the ROMs for the Super Extended Color Basic. And they're very large PCBs. I think they're dual-sided PCBs. They might be more layers than that, but they're very large. They have sort of an ancient feel to them. I've touched them. Very thrilling. Anyway, Alan Huffman helped liberate those, and at one point he had them lent to Mark Marlette. I don't know if Mark has returned them to Alan or if he still has them. The notion, of course, is that it might be worthwhile to reverse engineer the circuits there for a variety of reasons. One, just to understand the gimme better. But two, there's a rumor or conjecture that perhaps, at least at one point, the gimme had support for a 256 color mode. So an 8-bit color mode inside the gimme that has been rumored to exist. Nick Morentis did a lot of research on that. He has a web page dedicated to it. We'll have that linked in the show notes. Basically, he and Sockmaster identified something on a block diagram published for the internals of the gimme and sort of said, well, what is that and what does that mean? And kind of went from there. And Nick, at least at one point, seemed pretty convinced that, excuse the bell, that the gimme included another memory mode that would support an 8-bit color encoding. But nobody's managed to find it. So one of the things is with the prototypes is maybe if that mode ever existed, maybe it's there at the on the board for the CoCo. So those prototype boards don't have gimme ASICs on them. They have the gimme chip laid out in 74 series logic and such, or discrete logic. I'm sure there's some PALs and stuff in there too. But so that'd be an interesting thing to reverse engineer that board. I don't think that we just don't have the manpower, I think, to do it, but it hasn't really been done in any kind of formal way, at least not as far as I know. But it's out there, and maybe someday we'll learn all there is to know about the original gimme implementation. Now, in the realm of in a similar realm, what is true is that those horizontal resolutions that are beyond 160 characters, which also includes basically the 128, the 128 and 160 both are kind of in the same space. They occupy the same color clocks, and basically the 160 just sort of extends farther out on the sides. Anyway, 160 is really the magic number in NTSC. That's how many color clocks are supported in an NTSC signal. And a color clock's kind of like a pixel in that that's how often you can choose what color is going to be displayed on the screen. But it's kind of not like a pixel because it doesn't, by itself, it doesn't specify luminance. So you get kind of a weird thing in composite video signals. What is a pixel versus, colors versus pixels? It's sort of a different thing. The point of that I'm making is all those horizontal modes, horizontal resolution modes I mentioned earlier that were, 1280 horizontal pixels, or even 640 or 1024, even 320. All of those, when they're displayed on the composite video output, which includes the RF output, those will trigger an artifact color, assuming you haven't disabled the color burst. And so You can get, on an NTSC video display, you can get a lot more colors on the CoCo 3 through some manipulations of the palette registers and setting up one of these ultra high horizontal resolution modes. And like I said, at most you really only get 160 colors on the screen, but still with the various manipulations available, you can get essentially 8 bits worth of color put out in these virtual pixels. Done code, several people have done some code that displays this effect. I did a video on YouTube that gives my understanding of how it works, so I'll include a link to that in the show notes for those of you that are interested. Let's see, another note is that there were 2 versions of the Gimme available. I mentioned that there was a problem with the keyboard/joystick interrupt source. That apparently led to Tandy doing a respin of the chip, and I'm not sure what other items might have been addressed. I know there was something about sparklies in the video that basically if you access memory at certain times it would show up with little video artifacts that the 87 chip I think is supposed to have taken care of. So anyway, there are 2 versions of the Gimme out there. I think a lot of people have tried to replace their 86 Gimmes with 87 ones, but you will still see 86 Gimmes out there quite a bit. I don't know that I would rush to replace an 86 with an 87 if I wasn't having problems, but it probably is worthwhile to do if you do have an 87 available somehow. I'm not sure I would kill any CoCo 3s I'm sure I would not kill any 87 CoCo 3s to revive an 86 CoCo 3, but maybe somebody would think that's a good idea. I don't know. Anyway, there are 2 versions out there. You might take a look. Some of that information is detailed in Bill and Boise's book. One more note, occasionally you'll see somebody reference that, there's no PIAs on the CoCo 3, the Gimme just snoops the bus and accepts all the rights to the PIAs. Well, that's not true. The PIAs are there, they're on the motherboard, you can see them. What is true is that one of the PIAs, the one that normally has the pins that would talk to the control pins on the VDG on a CoCo 1 or 2, those pins are not connected to anything on the CoCo 3, or at least that's how it's shown in the schematics. And so the Gimme is snooping the writes to that one port and then translating them to whatever compatibility settings it has to do internally to support the CoCo style of video modes. But that PIA is still there. There's been some conjecture that could you possibly hook up a circuit that talks to those pins and do something with them. I'm not really sure if anybody's tried that. I'm not sure if that would work. It seems to me like, well, if it did work, it'd probably screw up your video because the Gimme's still going to snoop the rights to that location, but I'm not sure. Maybe there's something that could be done there. It's probably worth investigating. If you've tried doing anything with that, I would love to hear about it. So that's pretty much it. I did want to... When I was doing all this research, I kept stumbling across this, the number 6. I don't want to sound like some sort of crazy numerologist, but there's a number of little places here. Of course, the original CoCo DAC is 6 bits. The memory bank selects in the Gimme's MMU are 6 bits. There's 6 interrupt sources that can be mapped to either IRQ or FIRQ. The palette width is 6 bits. So I have to wonder, was there some sort of weird number 6 worshiper working at the Tandy Towers in the 80s? I don't know. That's a little strange. Obviously, that's a bit silly, but I don't know. I just couldn't help but remark on how the number 6 kept showing up. Anyway, that's probably enough of that. I hope you enjoyed my ramblings about the Gimme. No doubt I've missed any number of things. It is a complicated chip. Feel free to send us feedback to the show, feedback@cococrew.org. You can send hate mail to me directly, john@cococrew.org. And write us something on the Facebook page, whatever. If you have any projects involving CoCo 3, especially any that touch on any of the technical details either presented here, or especially if there's technical details I've missed that you're working on a project that tickles, I would love to hear about it. So let us know. Send us something on the Facebook group. Send us some email. Look me up on the telephone and call me. Whatever. All right. Well, thanks. I hope you enjoyed it. And I'm not sure what we'll talk about next time. Pretty much done with the describing CoCo architecture, but maybe we'll talk about some of the peripherals, or I'm not sure what else, but I'm sure we'll find something. So anyway, CoCo forever. Take care.
Please select your monitor type.
Get ready, player one.
Alright, welcome back to another edition of The Games Corner. On this episode, I'm going to go all out and review a game for the Color Computer 3 that I've always found fascinating. The game is called The Contras. It is published by Sundog Systems. Now, anybody that knows Sundog Systems, they were a publisher that always released super high-end games that pushed the CoCo to the limits. Even going back to the earlier days with the CoCo 1 and 2, they always released games that would be close to arcade quality with digital speech and animation, usually requiring the CoCo to have maxed out RAM such as 64K on the CoCo 1 and 2 and 512K on the CoCo 3. The Contras, I am sure you can guess, is a clone of the game Contra. It is a platformer-style game with side-scrolling levels. The object is fairly simple. Get through each level by walking to the right while dodging and blowing up enemies. At the end of each level, there's a boss you must defeat before you can make it on to the next level. This version of Contra for the CoCo is a very interesting conversion. Rather than being based on the arcade version, it is a close copy of the Nintendo NES console version, which I am okay with because I've always preferred the Nintendo version over the arcade one. It takes advantage of 2-button joysticks, one for fire and one for jumping. It also supports 2 players at the same time. This is kind of a breakthrough. Not many Color Computer 3 games supported this feature. It has 6 levels in total, just like the Nintendo version. However, only the first 3 levels are from the Nintendo version. The other 3 are modified levels from the first 3, and unfortunately due to a messy development history, this game only has 2 music tracks and is also missing 4 power-up weapons out of 6. While playing the game, you can actually see and get the power-ups, but they don't activate or do anything. The game can also be a bit buggy at times. A little bit of history about this game. Apparently what happened is the original developer stopped working on this game back in 1991. Then it was passed off to another coder to finish the game. The new coder had never finished someone else's work before and had to get familiar with the game code. It was eventually released in 1993 and was distributed only through mail order. It is practically impossible to find a physical copy of the Contras today. I can't ever recall seeing a copy for sale on the CoCo list or on eBay for that matter. So if you have a copy and would like to sell it, please drop me a line. Don't own the original? Well, luckily there is a disc image available on the CoCo Archive website. The disc image is heavily copy protected, but if you have a CoCo SDC, you'll be able to play it with no problems, assuming your CoCo 3 has 512K in it. My final thoughts on this game are, despite the shortcomings, it is still a super fun game to play. It really is impressive and probably one of the most ambitious CoCo 3 games ever attempted, making use of multi-voice music and sound effects, horizontal scrolling, large maps, and dual-player modes. And it also doesn't have black borders like a lot of the other similar side-scrolling CoCo 3 games from the same time. And after all, we can't complain. At least this game was eventually released for all of us to enjoy. Who knows, perhaps someday we may see The Last Ninja get released either finished or unfinished for a fellow CoCo coder to take on as a project. Well, I hope you enjoyed this month's episode of The Games Corner. Until next month, game on.
Get ready, player 2.
Well, it's that time again. We have reached the end of episode 6. Wow, 7 episodes in the bag already. We hope you enjoyed the show. Please keep your feedback coming in. I would like to thank my host, John Linville, for providing the Gimme Chip tech segment. I have to say, this has been my favorite tech segment yet. The Gimme Chip has always been a mystery to me. We also would like to thank all of you for listening. You really are the most important part of the show. If we didn't have you, it would be a bit silly for John and I to be talking to ourselves. Stay tuned for next month's show, and until then, happy CoCoing.